Chapter 25 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patty Cunningham. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 25. Lieutenant Such comes off the half-pay list. At the time when Calder, disappointed at his failure to obtain news of Feversham from the one man who possessed it, stepped into a carriage of the train at Aswan, Lieutenant Such was driving along a high white road of Hampshire across a common of heather and gorse, and he too was troubled on Harry Feversham's account. Like many a man who lives much alone, Lieutenant Such had fallen into the habit of speaking his thoughts aloud, and as he drove slowly and reluctantly forward, more than once he said to himself, "I foresaw there would be trouble. From the beginning I foresaw there would be trouble." The ridge of hill along which he drove dipped suddenly to a hollow. Such saw the road run steeply down in front of him between forests of pines to a little railway station. The sight of the rails gleaming bright in the afternoon sunlight, and the telegraph poles running away in a straight line until they seemed to huddle together in the distance, increased Such's discomposure. He reined his pony in, and sat staring with a frown at the red-tiled roof of the station building. "I promised Harry to say nothing," he said, and drawing some makeshift of comfort from the words, repeated them. "I promised faithfully in the Criterion grill room." The whistle of an engine a long way off sounded clear and shrill. It roused Lieutenant Such from his gloomy meditations. He saw the white smoke of an approaching train stretch out like a riband in the distance. "I wonder what brings him," he said doubtfully, and then with an effort at courage, "Well, it's no use shirking." He flicked the pony with his whip and drove briskly down the hill. He reached the station as the train drew up at the platform. Only 2 passengers descended from the train. They were Durrance and his servant, and they came out at once onto the road. Lieutenant Such hailed Durrance, who walked to the side of the trap. "You received my telegram in time, then," said Durrance. "Luckily it found me at home." "I have brought a bag. May I trespass upon you for a night's lodging?" "By all means," said Such, but the tone of his voice quite clearly to Durrance's ears belied the heartiness of the words. Durrance, however, was prepared for a reluctant welcome, and he had purposely sent his telegram at the last moment. Had he given an address, he suspected that he might have received a refusal of his visit. And his suspicion was accurate enough. The telegram, it is true, had merely announced Durrance's visit. It had stated nothing of his object. But its dispatch was sufficient to warn Such that something grave had happened, something untoward in the relations of Ethne Eustace and Durrance. Durrance had come, no doubt, to renew his inquiries about Harry Feversham, those inquiries which Such was on no account to answer, which he must parry all this afternoon and night. But he saw Durrance feeling about with his raised foot for the step of the trap, and the fact of his visitor's blindness was brought home to him. He reached out a hand, and catching Durrance by the arm, helped him up. After all, he thought, it would not be difficult to hoodwink a blind man. Ethne herself had had the same thought, and felt much the same relief as Such felt now. The lieutenant, indeed, was so relieved that he found room for an impulse of pity. "I was very sorry, Durrance, to hear of your bad luck," he said, as he drove off up the hill. "I know what it is myself to be suddenly stopped and put aside just when one is making way and the world is smoothing itself out, though my wound in the leg is nothing in comparison to your blindness. I don't talk to you about compensations and patience. That's the gabble of people who are comfortable and haven't suffered. We know that for a man who is young and active, and who is doing well in a career where activity is a necessity, there are no compensations if his career is suddenly cut short through no fault of his." "Through no fault of his," repeated Durrance. "I agree with you. It is only the man whose career is cut short through his own fault who gets compensations." Sutch glanced sharply at his companion. Durrance had spoken slowly and very thoughtfully. Did he mean to refer to Harry Feversham, Sutch wondered? Did he know enough to be able to so refer to him? Or was it merely by chance that his words were so strikingly apposite? "Compensations of what kind?" Sutch asked uneasily. "The chance of knowing himself, for one thing. For the cheap thing. He is brought up short, stopped in his career, perhaps disgraced." Sutch started a little at the word. "Yes, perhaps disgraced," Durrance repeated. "Well, the shock of the disgrace is, after all, his opportunity. Don't you see that? It's his opportunity to know himself at last. Up to the moment of disgrace, his life has been all sham and illusion. The man he believed himself to be, he never was, and now at last he knows it. Once he knows it, he can set about to retrieve his disgrace. Oh, there are compensations for such a man. You and I know a case in point." Sutch no longer doubted that Durrance was deliberately referring to Harry Feversham. He had some knowledge, though how he had gained it Sutch could not guess. But the knowledge was not to Sutch's idea quite accurate, and the inaccuracy did Harry Feversham some injustice. It was on that account chiefly that Sutch did not affect any ignorance as to Durrance's allusion. The passage of the years had not diminished his great regard for Harry. He cared for him, indeed, with a woman's concentration of love, and he could not endure that his memory should be slighted. "The case you and I know of is not quite in point," he argued. "You are speaking of Harry Feversham, who believed himself a coward and was not one. He commits the fault which stops his career, he finds out his mistake, he sets himself to the work of retrieving his disgrace. Surely it's a case quite in point." "Yes, I see," Sutch agreed. "There is another view, a wrong view as I know, but I thought for the moment it was your view, that Harry fancied himself to be a brave man and was suddenly brought up short by discovering that he was a coward. But how did you find out? No one knew the whole truth except myself." "I am engaged to Miss Eustace," said Durrance. "She did not know everything. She knew of the disgrace, but she did not know of the determination to retrieve it." "She knows now," said Durrance. And he added sharply, "You are glad of that?" "Very glad." Sutch was not aware that by any movement or exclamation he had betrayed his pleasure. His face, no doubt, showed it clearly enough, but Durrance could not see his face. Lieutenant Sutch was puzzled, but he did not deny the imputation. "It is true," he said stoutly. "I am very glad that she knows. I can quite see that from your point of view it would be better if she did not know, but I cannot help it. I am very glad." Durrance laughed, and not at all unpleasantly. "I like you the better for being glad," he said. "But how does Miss Eustace know?" asked Sutch. "Who told her? I did not, and there was no one else who could tell her." "You are wrong. There is Captain Willoughby. He came to Devonshire 6 weeks ago. He brought with him a white feather which he gave to Miss Eustace as a proof that he withdrew his charge of cowardice against Harry Feversham." Sutch stopped the pony in the middle of the road. He no longer troubled to conceal the joy which this good news caused him. Indeed, he forgot altogether Durrance's presence at his side. He sat quite silent and still, with a glow of happiness upon him, such as he had never known in all his life. He was an old man now, well on in his 60s. He had reached an age when the blood runs slow and the pleasures are of a grey, sober kind, and joy has lost its fevers. But there welled up in his heart a gladness of such buoyancy as only falls to the lot of youth. 5 years ago, on the pier of Dover, he had watched a mail packet steam away into darkness and rain, and had prayed that he might live until this great moment should come. And he had lived, and it had come. His heart was lifted up in gratitude. It seemed to him that there was a great burst of sunlight across the world, and that the world itself had suddenly grown many-colored and a place of joys. Ever since the night when he had stood outside the War Office in Pall Mall, and Harry Feversham had touched him on the arm and had spoken out his despair, Lieutenant Sutch had been oppressed with a sense of guilt. Harry was Muriel Feversham's boy, and Sutch just for that reason should have watched him and mothered him in his boyhood since his mother was dead, and fathered him in his youth since his father did not understand. But he had failed. He had failed in a sacred trust, and he had imagined Muriel Feversham's eyes looking at him with reproach from the barrier of the skies. He had heard her voice in his dreams saying to him gently, ever so gently, "Since I was dead, since I was taken away to where I could only see and not help, surely you might have helped. Just for my sake you might have helped. You whose work in the world was at an end." And the long tale of his inactive years had stood up to accuse him. Now, however, the guilt was lifted from his shoulders, and by Harry Feversham's own act. The news was not altogether unexpected, but the lightness of spirit which he felt showed him how much he had counted upon its coming. "I knew," he exclaimed. "I knew he wouldn't fail. Oh, I am glad you came today, Colonel Durrance. It was partly my fault, you see, that Harry Feversham ever incurred that charge of cowardice. I could have spoken. There was an opportunity on one of the Crimean nights at Broad Place, and a word might have been of value. And I held my tongue. I have never ceased to blame myself. I am grateful for your news. You have the particulars? Captain Willoughby was in peril, and Harry came to his aid?" "No, it was not that exactly." "Tell me, tell me." He feared to miss a word. Durrance related the story of the Gordon letters, and their recovery by Feversham. It was all too short for Lieutenant Sutch. "Oh, but I am glad you came," he cried. "You understand, at all events," said Durrance, "that I have not come to repeat to you the questions I asked in the courtyard of my club. I am able, on the contrary, to give you information." Sutch spoke to the pony and drove on. He had said nothing which could reveal to Durrance his fear that to renew those questions was the object of his visit, and he was a little perplexed at the accuracy of Durrance's conjecture. But the great news to which he had listened hindered him from giving thought to that perplexity. "So Miss Eustace told you the story," he said, "and showed you the feather?" "No, indeed," replied Durrance. "She said not a word about it. She never showed me the feather. She even forbade Willoughby to hint of it. She sent him away from Devonshire before I knew that he had come. You were disappointed at that," he added quickly. Lieutenant Sutch was startled. It was true he was disappointed. He was jealous of Durrance. He wished Harry Feversham to stand first in the girl's thoughts. It was for her sake that Harry had set about his difficult and perilous work. Sutch wished her to remember him as he remembered her. Therefore he was disappointed that she did not at once come with her news to Durrance and break off their engagement. It would be hard for Durrance, no doubt, but that could not be helped. "Then how did you learn the story?" asked Sutch. "Someone else told me. I was told that Willoughby had come, and that he had brought a white feather, and that Ethne had taken it from him. Never mind by whom. That gave me a clue. I lay in wait for Willoughby in London. He is not very clever. He tried to obey Ethne's command of silence, but I managed to extract the information I wanted. The rest of the story I was able to put together by myself. Ethne now and then was off her guard." "You are surprised that I was clever enough to find out the truth by the exercise of my own wits?" said Durrance with a laugh. Lieutenant Sutch jumped in his seat. It was mere chance, of course, that Durrance continually guessed with so singular an accuracy. Still, it was uncomfortable. "I have said nothing which would any way suggest that I was surprised," he said testily. "That is quite true, but you are none the less surprised," continued Durrance. "I don't blame you. You could not know that it is only since I have been blind that I have begun to see. Shall I give you an instance? This is the first time that I have ever come into this neighborhood or got out at your station. Well, I can tell you that you have driven me up a hill between forests of pines, and are now driving me across open country of heather." Sutch turned quickly towards Durrance. "The hill, of course, you would notice, but the pines?" "The air was close. I knew there were trees. I guessed they were pines." "And the open country?" "The wind blows clear across it. There's a dry, stiff rustle besides. I have never heard quite that sound except when the wind blows across heather." He turned the conversation back to Harry Feversham and his disappearance, and the cause of his disappearance. He made no mention, Sutch remarked, of the fourth white feather which Ethne herself had added to the 3. But the history of the 3 which had come by the post to Ramelton he knew to its last letter. "I was acquainted with the men who sent them," he said. "Trench, Castleton, Willoughby. I met them daily in Suakin. Just ordinary officers, one rather shrewd, the second quite commonplace, the third distinctly stupid. I saw them going quietly about the routine of their work. It seems quite strange to me now. There should have been some mark set upon them, setting them apart as the particular messengers of fate. But there was nothing of the kind. They were just ordinary, prosaic regimental officers. Doesn't it seem strange to you, too? Here were men who could deal out misery and estrangement and years of suffering without so much as a single word spoken, and they went about their business, and you never knew them from other men until a long while afterwards some consequence of what they did, and very likely have forgotten, rises up and strikes you down." "Yes," said Sutch, "that thought has occurred to me." He fell to wondering again what object had brought Durrance into Hampshire, since he did not come for information, but Durrance did not immediately enlighten him. They reached the lieutenant's house. It stood alone by the roadside, looking across a wild country of downs. Sutch took Durrance over his stable, and showed him his horses. He explained to him the arrangement of his garden and the grouping of his flowers. Still Durrance said nothing about the reason of his visit. He ceased to talk of Harry Feversham, and assumed a great interest in the lieutenant's garden. But indeed the interest was not all pretense. These 2 men had something in common, as Sutch had pointed out at the moment of their meeting: the abrupt termination of a promising career. One of the 2 was old, the other comparatively young, and the younger man was most curious to discover how his elder had managed to live through the dragging profitless years alone. The same sort of lonely life lay stretched out before Durrance, and he was anxious to learn what alleviations could be practiced, what small interests could be discovered, how best it could be got through. "You don't live within sight of the sea," he said at last, as they stood together, after making the round of the garden, at the door. "No, I dare not," said Sutch, and Durrance nodded his head in complete sympathy and comprehension. "I understand. You care for it too much. You would have the full knowledge of your loss presented to your eyes each moment." They went into the house. Still Durrance did not refer to the object of his visit. They dined together and sat over their wine alone. Still Durrance did not speak. It fell to Lieutenant Sutch to recur to the subject of Harry Feversham. A thought had been gaining strength in his mind all that afternoon, and since Durrance would not lead up to its utterance, he spoke it out himself. "Harry Feversham must come back to England. He has done enough to redeem his honor." Harry Feversham's return might be a little awkward for Durrance, and Lieutenant Sutch, with that notion in his mind, blurted out his sentences awkwardly, but to his surprise Durrance answered him at once. "I was waiting for you to say that. I wanted you to realize without any suggestion of mine that Harry must return. It was with that object that I came." Lieutenant Sutch's relief was great. He had been prepared for an objection. At the best, he only expected a reluctant acquiescence, and in the greatness of his relief he spoke again. "His return will not really trouble you or your wife, since Miss Eustace has forgotten him." Durrance shook his head. "She has not forgotten him. But she kept silence, even after Willoughby had brought the feather back. You told me so this afternoon. She said not a word to you. She forbade Willoughby to tell you." "She is very true, very loyal," returned Durrance. "She has pledged herself to me, and nothing in the world, no promise of happiness, no thought of Harry, would induce her to break her pledge. I know her. But I know, too, that she only plighted herself to me out of pity because I was blind. I know that she has not forgotten Harry." Lieutenant Sutch leaned back in his chair and smiled. He could have laughed outright. He asked for no details. He did not doubt Durrance's words. He was overwhelmed with pride in that Harry Feversham, in spite of his disgrace and his long absence, Harry Feversham, his favorite, had retained this girl's love. No doubt she was very true, very loyal. Sutch endowed her on the instant with all the good qualities possible to a human being. The nobler she was, the greater was his pride that Harry Feversham still retained her heart. Lieutenant Sutch fairly revelled in this new knowledge. It was not to be wondered at after all, he thought. There was nothing astonishing in the girl's fidelity to anyone who was really acquainted with Harry Feversham. It was only an occasion of great gladness. Durrance would have to get out of the way, of course, but then he should never have crossed Harry Feversham's path. Sutch was cruel with the perfect cruelty of which love alone is capable. "You are very glad of that," said Durrance quietly. "Very glad that Ethne has not forgotten him. It is a little hard on me, perhaps, who have not much left. It would have been less hard if 2 years ago you had told me the whole truth when I asked it of you that summer evening in the courtyard of the club." Compunction seized upon Lieutenant Sutch. The gentleness with which Durrance had spoken, and the quiet accent of weariness in his voice, brought home to him something of the cruelty of his great joy and pride. After all, what Durrance said was true. If he had broken his word that night at the club, if he had related Feversham's story, Durrance would have been spared a great deal. "I couldn't," he exclaimed. "I promised Harry in the most solemn way that I would tell no one until he came back himself. I was sorely tempted to tell you, but I had given my word. Even if Harry never came back, if I obtained sure knowledge that he was dead, even then I was only to tell his father, and even his father not all that could be told on his behalf." He pushed back his chair and went to the window. "It is hot in here," he said. "Do you mind?" And without waiting for an answer, he loosed the catch and raised the sash. For some little while he stood by the open window, silent, undecided. Durrance plainly did not know of the fourth feather broken off from Ethne's fan. He had not heard the conversation between himself and Feversham in the grill room of the Criterion restaurant. There were certain words spoken by Harry upon that occasion which it seemed fair Durrance should now hear. Compunction and pity bade Sutch repeat them. His love of Harry Feversham enjoined him to hold his tongue. He could plead again that Harry had forbidden him speech, but the plea would be an excuse and nothing more. He knew very well that were Harry present, Harry would repeat them, and Lieutenant Sutch knew what harm silence had already done. He mastered his love in the end, and came back to the table. "There is something which it is fair you should know," he said. "When Harry went away to redeem his honor, if the opportunity should come, he had no hope, indeed he had no wish, that Miss Eustace should wait for him. She was the spur to urge him, but she did not know even that. He did not wish her to know. He had no claim upon her. There was not even a hope in his mind that she might at some time be his friend, in this life at all events. When he went away from Ramelton, he parted from her, according to his thought, for all his mortal life. It is fair that you should know that. Miss Eustace, you tell me, is not the woman to withdraw from her pledged word. Well, what I said to you that evening at the club I now repeat. There will be no disloyalty to friendship if you marry Miss Eustace." It was a difficult speech for Lieutenant Sutch to utter, and he was very glad when he had uttered it. Whatever answer he received, it was right that the words should be spoken, and he knew that, had he refrained from speech, he would always have suffered remorse for his silence. None the less, however, he waited in suspense for the answer. "It is kind of you to tell me that," said Durrance, and he smiled at the lieutenant with a great friendliness. "For I can guess what the words cost you. But you have done Harry Feversham no harm by speaking them, for, as I told you, Ethne has not forgotten him, and I have my point of view. Marriage between a man blind like myself and any woman, let alone Ethne, could not be fair or right unless upon both sides there was more than friendship. Harry must return to England. He must return to Ethne, too. You must go to Egypt and do what you can to bring him back." Sutch was relieved of his suspense. He had obeyed his conscience, and yet done Harry Feversham no disservice. "I will start tomorrow," he said. "Harry is still in the Soudan?" "Of course." "Why of course?" asked Sutch. "Willoughby withdrew his accusation. Castleton is dead. He was killed at Tamai. And Trench, I know, for I have followed all these three men's careers, Trench is a prisoner at Omdurman. So is Harry Feversham." Sutch stared at his visitor. For a moment he did not understand. The shock had been too sudden and abrupt. Then, after comprehension dawned upon him, he refused to believe. The folly of that refusal in its turn became apparent. He sat down in his chair opposite to Durrance, awed into silence. And the silence lasted for a long while. "What am I to do?" he said at length. "I have thought it out," returned Durrance. "You must go to Suakin. I will give you a letter to Willoughby, who is deputy governor, and another to a Greek merchant there whom I know and on whom you can draw for as much money as you require." "That's good of you, Durrance, upon my word," Sutch interrupted, and forgetting that he was talking to a blind man, he held out his hand across the table. "I would not take a penny if I could help it, but I am a poor man. Upon my soul, it's good of you." "Just listen to me, please," said Durrance. He could not see the outstretched hand, but his voice showed that he would hardly have taken it if he had. He was striking the final blow at his chance of happiness, but he did not wish to be thanked for it. "At Suakin you must take the Greek merchant's advice and organize a rescue as best you can. It will be a long business, and you will have many disappointments before you succeed, but you must stick to it until you do." Upon that the two men fell to a discussion of the details of the length of time which it would take for a message from Suakin to be carried into Omdurman, of the untrustworthiness of some Arab spies, and of the risks which the trustworthy ran. Sutch's house was searched for maps. The various routes by which the prisoners might escape were described by Durrance. The great 40 days' road from Kordofan on the west, the straight track from Omdurman to Berber and from Berber to Suakin, and the desert journey across the belly of stones by the wells of Murat to Korosko. It was late before Durrance had told all that he thought necessary, and Sutch had exhausted his questions. "You will stay at Suakin as your base of operations," said Durrance, as he closed up the maps. "Yes," answered Sutch, as he rose from his chair. "I will start as soon as you give me the letters." "I have them already written." "Then I will start tomorrow. You may be sure I will let both you and Miss Eustace know how the attempt progresses." "Let me know," said Durrance, "but not a whisper of it to Ethne." "She knows nothing of my plan, and she must know nothing until Feversham comes back himself. She has her point of view, as I have mine. 2 lives shall not be spoilt because of her. That's her resolve. She believes that to some degree she was herself the cause of Harry Feversham's disgrace, that but for her he would not have resigned his commission." "Yes." "You agree with that?" At all events, she believes it. So there's one life spoilt because of her. Suppose now I go to her and say, 'I know that you pretend out of your charity and kindness to care for me, but in your heart you are no more than my friend.' Why, I hurt her, and cruelly. For there's all that's left of the second life spoilt too. But bring back Feversham. Then I can speak, then I can say freely, 'Since you are just my friend, I would rather be your friend and nothing more, so neither life will be spoilt at all.'" "I understand," said Sutch. "It's the way a man should speak. So till Feversham comes back the pretense remains. She pretends to care for you. You pretend you do not know she thinks of Harry. While I go eastwards to bring him home, you go back to her." "No," said Durrance, "I can't go back." The strain of keeping up the pretense was telling too much on both of us. "I go to Wiesbaden. An oculist lives there who serves me for an excuse. I shall wait at Wiesbaden until you bring Harry home." Sutch opened the door, and the two men went out into the hall. The servants had long since gone to bed. A couple of candlesticks stood upon a table beside a lamp. More than once Lieutenant Sutch had forgotten that his visitor was blind, and he forgot the fact again. He lighted both candles and held out one to his companion. Durrance knew from the noise of Sutch's movements what he was doing. "I have no need of a candle," he said with a smile. The light fell full upon his face, and Sutch suddenly remarked how tired it looked and old. There were deep lines from the nostrils to the corners of the mouth, and furrows in the cheeks. His hair was gray as an old man's hair. Durrance had himself made so little of his misfortune this evening that Sutch had rather come to rate it as a small thing in the sum of human calamities. But he read his mistake now in Durrance's face. Just above the flame of the candle, framed in the darkness of the hall, it showed white and drawn and haggard, the face of an old worn man set upon the stalwart shoulders of a man in the prime of his years. "I have said very little to you in the way of sympathy," said Sutch. "I did not know that you would welcome it. But I am sorry. I am very sorry." "Thanks," said Durrance simply. He stood for a moment or two silently in front of his host. "When I was in the Soudan, traveling through the deserts, I used to pass the white skeletons of camels lying by the side of the track. Do you know the camel's way? He is an unfriendly, graceless beast, but he marches to within an hour of his death. He drops and dies with the load upon his back. It seemed to me, even in those days, the right and enviable way to finish. You can imagine how I must envy them that advantage of theirs now. Good night." He felt for the banister and walked up the stairs to his room. End of chapter 25. Recording by Patty Cunningham.
Chapter 26 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lewis. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 26. General Feversham's portraits are appeased. Lieutenant Sutch, though he went late to bed, was early astir in the morning. He roused the household, packed and repacked his clothes, and made such a bustle and confusion that everything to be done took twice its ordinary time in the doing. There never had been so much noise and flurry in the house during all the 30 years of Lieutenant Sutch's residence. His servants could not satisfy him, however quickly they scuttled about the passages in search of this or that forgotten article of his old travelling outfit. Sutch, indeed, was in a boyish fever of excitement. It was not to be wondered at, perhaps. For 30 years he had lived inactive, on the world's half-pay list, to quote his own phrase, and at the end of all that long time, miraculously, something had fallen to him to do, something important, something which needed energy and tact and decision. Lieutenant Stutch, in a word, was to be employed again. He was feverish to begin his employment. He dreaded the short interval before he could begin, lest some hindrance should unexpectedly occur and relegate him again to inactivity. "I shall be ready this afternoon," he said briskly to Durrance as they breakfasted. "I shall catch the night mail to the Continent. We might go up to London together, for London is on your way to Wiesbaden." "No," said Durrance. "I have just one more visit to pay in England. I did not think of it until I was in bed last night. You put it into my head." "Oh," observed Stutch, "and whom do you propose to visit?" "General Feversham," replied Durrance. Stutch laid down his knife and fork and looked with surprise at his companion. "Why in the world do you wish to see him?" he asked. "I want to tell him how Harry has redeemed his honour, how he is still redeeming it. You said last night that you were bound by a promise not to tell him anything of his son's intentions, or even of his son's successes, until the son returned himself. But I am bound by no such promise. I think such a promise bears hardly on the General. There is nothing in the world which could pain him so much as the proof that his son was a coward. Harry might have robbed and murdered. The old man would have preferred to have him commit both these crimes. I shall cross into Surrey this morning and tell him that Harry never was a coward." Stutch shook his head. "He will not be able to understand. He will be very grateful to you, of course. He will be very glad that Harry has atoned his disgrace, but he will never understand why he incurred it. And, after all, he will only be glad because the family honour is restored." "I don't agree," said Durrance. "I believe the old man is rather fond of his son, though to be sure he would never admit it. I rather like General Feversham." Lieutenant Stutch had seen very little of General Feversham during the last 5 years. He could not forgive him for his share in the responsibility of Harry Feversham's ruin. Had the general been capable of sympathy with and comprehension of the boy's nature, the white feathers never would have been sent to Ramelton. Stutch pictured the old man sitting sternly on his terrace at Broad Place, quite unaware that he was himself at all to blame, and on the contrary rather inclined to pose as a martyr, in that his son had turned out a shame and disgrace to all the dead Fevershams, whose portraits hung darkly on the high walls of the hall. Stutch felt that he could never endure to talk patiently with General Feversham, and he was sure that no argument would turn that stubborn man from his convictions. He had not troubled at all to consider whether the news which Durrance had brought should be handed on to Broad Place. "You are very thoughtful for others," he said to Durrance. "It's not to my credit. I practice thoughtfulness for others out of an instinct of self-preservation. That's all," said Durrance. "Selfishness is the natural and encroaching fault of the blind. I know that, so I am careful to guard against it." He travelled accordingly that morning by branch line from Hampshire into Surrey, and came to Broad Place in the glow of the afternoon. General Feversham was now within a few months of his 80th year, and though his back was as stiff and his figure as erect as on that night now so many years ago when he first presented Harry to his Crimean friends, he was shrunken in stature, and his face seemed to have grown small. Durrance had walked with the general upon the terrace only 2 years ago, and, blind though he was, he noticed a change within this interval of time. Old Feversham walked with a heavier step, and there had come a note of puerility into his voice. "You have joined the veterans before your time, Durrance," he said. "I read of it in a newspaper. I would have written had I known where to write." If he had any suspicion of Durrance's visit, he gave no sign of it. He rang the bell, and tea was brought into the great hall where the portraits hung. He asked after this and that officer in the Soudan with whom he was acquainted. He discussed the iniquities of the War Office, and feared that the country was going to the deuce. "Everything, through ill luck or bad management, is going to the devil, sir," he exclaimed irritably. "Even you, Durrance. You're not the same man who walked with me on my terrace 2 years ago." The General had never been remarkable for tact, and the solitary life he led had certainly brought no improvement. Durrance could have countered with a tu quoque, but he refrained. "But I come upon the same business," he said. Feversham sat up stiffly in his chair. "And I give you the same answer. I have nothing to say about Harry Feversham. I will not discuss him." He spoke in his usual hard and emotionless voice. He might have been speaking of a stranger. Even the name was uttered without the slightest hint of sorrow. Durrance began to wonder whether the fountains of affection had not been altogether dried up in General Feversham's heart. "It would not please you, then, to know where Harry Feversham has been, and how he has lived during the last 5 years?" There was a pause, not a long pause, but still a pause, before General Feversham answered, "Not in the least, Colonel Durrance." The answer was uncompromising, but Durrance relied upon the pause which preceded it. "Nor on what business he has been engaged?" he continued. "I am not interested in the smallest degree. I do not wish him to starve, and my solicitor tells me that he draws his allowance. I am content with that knowledge, Colonel Durrance." "I will risk your anger, General," said Durrance. "There are times when it is wise to disobey one's superior officer. This is one of the times. Of course you can turn me out of the house. Otherwise I shall relate to you the history of your son and my friend since he disappeared from England." General Feversham laughed. "Of course I can't turn you out of the house," he said, and then he added severely, "but I warn you that you are taking an improper advantage of your position as my guest." "Yes, there is no doubt of that," Durrance answered calmly, and he told his story: the recovery of the Gordon letters from Berber, his own meeting with Harry Feversham at Wadi Halfa, and Harry's imprisonment at Omdurman. He brought it down to that very day, for he ended with the news of Lieutenant Sutch's departure for Suakin. General Feversham heard the whole account without an interruption, without even stirring in his chair. Durrance could not tell in what spirit he listened, but he drew some comfort from the fact that he did listen, and without argument. For some while after Durrance had finished, the General sat silent. He raised his hand to his forehead and shaded his eyes, as though the man who had spoken could see, and thus he remained. Even when he did speak, he did not take his hand away. Pride forbade him to show to those portraits on the wall that he was capable even of so natural a weakness as joy at the reconquest of honour by his son. "What I don't understand," he said slowly, "is why Harry ever resigned his commission. I could not understand it before. I understand it even less now, since you have told me of his great bravery. It is one of the queer inexplicable things. They happen, and there's all that can be said. But I am very glad that you compelled me to listen to you, Durrance. I did it with a definite object. It is for you to say, of course, but for my part, I do not see why Harry should not come home and enter in again to all that he lost." "He cannot regain everything," said Feversham. "It is not right that he should. He committed the sin, and he must pay. He cannot regain his career, for one thing." "No, that is true. But he can find another. He is not yet so old but that he can find another, and that is all he will have lost." General Feversham now took his hand away and moved in his chair. He looked quickly at Durrance. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but changed his mind. "Well," he said briskly, as though the matter were of no particular importance, "if Sutch can manage Harry's escape from Omdurman, I see no reason either why he should not come home." Durrance rose from his chair. "Thank you, General. If you can have me driven to the station, I can catch a train to town. There's one at 6. "But you will stay the night, surely?" cried General Feversham. "It is impossible. I start for Wiesbaden early tomorrow." Feversham rang the bell and gave the order for a carriage. "I should have been very glad if you could have stayed," he said, turning to Durrance. "I see very few people nowadays. To tell the truth, I have no great desire to see many. One grows old and a creature of customs." "But you have your Crimean nights," said Durrance cheerfully. Feversham shook his head. "There have been none since Harry went away. I had no heart for them," he said slowly. For a second the mask was lifted, and his stern features softened. He had suffered much during these 5 lonely years of his old age, though not one of his acquaintances up to this moment had ever detected a look upon his face or heard a sentence from his lips which could lead them so to think. He had shown a stubborn front to the world. He had made it a matter of pride that no one should be able to point a finger at him and say, "There's a man struck down." But on this one occasion, and in these few words, he revealed to Durrance the depths of his grief. Durrance understood how unendurable the chatter of his friends about the old days of war in the snowy trenches would have been. An anecdote recalling some particular act of courage would hurt as keenly as a story of cowardice. The whole history of his lonely life at Broad Place was laid bare in that simple statement that there had been no Crimean nights, for he had no heart for them. The wheels of the carriage rattled on the gravel. "Good-bye," said Durrance, and he held out his hand. "By the way," said Feversham, "to organize this escape from Omdurman will cost a great deal of money. Sutch is a poor man. Who is paying?" "I am." Feversham shook Durrance's hand in a firm clasp. "It is my right, of course," he said. "Certainly. I will let you know what it costs." "Thank you." General Feversham accompanied his visitor to the door. There was a question which he had in his mind to ask, but the question was delicate. He stood uneasily on the steps of the house. "Didn't I hear, Durrance," he said with an air of carelessness, "that you were engaged to Miss Eustace?" "I think I said that Harry would regain all that he had lost except his career," said Durrance. He stepped into the carriage and drove off to the station. His work was ended. There was nothing more for him now to do except to wait at Wiesbaden and pray that Sutch might succeed. He had devised a plan. It remained for those who had eyes wherewith to see to execute it. General Feversham stood upon the steps, looking after the carriage until it disappeared among the pines. Then he walked slowly back into the hall. "There is no reason why he should not come back," he said. He looked up at the pictures. The dead Fevershams in their uniforms would not be disgraced. "No reason in the world," he said, "and please God he will come back soon." The dangers of an escape from the Dervish city remote among the sands began to loom very large on his mind. He owned to himself that he felt very tired and old, and many times that night he repeated his prayer, "Please God, Harry will come back soon," as he sat erect upon the bench which had once been his wife's favourite seat, and gazed out across the moonlit country to the Sussex Downs. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lewis. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason, Chapter 27. The House of Stone. These were the days before the great mud wall was built about the House of Stone in Omdurman. Only a thorn zareby as yet enclosed that noisome prison, and the space around it. It stood upon the eastern border of the town, surely the most squalid capital of any empire since the world began. Not a flower bloomed in a single corner. There was no grass, nor the green shade of any tree. A brown and stony plain, burnt by the sun, and built upon it a straggling narrow city of hovels, crawling with vermin and poisoned with disease. Between the prison and the Nile no houses stood, and at this time the prisoners were allowed, so long as daylight lasted, to stumble in their chains down the half-mile of broken sloping earth to the Nile bank, so that they might draw water for their use and perform their ablutions. For the native, or the Negro, then, escape was not so difficult, for along that bank the dhows were moored, and they were numerous. The river traffic, such as there was of it, had its harbour there, and the wide foreshore made a convenient market-place. Thus the open space between the river and the House of Stone was thronged and clamorous all day. Captives rubbed elbows with their friends, concerted plans of escape, or then and there slipped into the thickest of the crowd and made their way to the first blacksmith, with whom the price of iron outweighed any risk he took. But even on their way to the blacksmith shop, their fetters called for no notice in Omdurman. Slaves wore them as a daily habit, and hardly a street in all that long, brown, treeless, squalid city was ever free from the clink of a man who walked in chains. But for the Europeans, escape was another matter. There were not so many white prisoners but that each was a marked man. Besides relays of camels stationed through the desert, much money, long preparations, and above all, devoted natives who would risk their lives, were the first necessities for their evasion. The camels might be procured and stationed, but it did not follow that their drivers would remain at the stations. The long preparations might be made, and the whip of the jailer overset them at the end by flogging the captive within an inch of his life, on a suspicion that he had money. The devoted servant might shirk at the last moment. Colonel Trench began to lose all hope. His friends were working for him, he knew, for at times the boy who brought his food into the prison would bid him be ready. At times, too, when at some parade of the Khalifa's troops he was shown in triumph as an emblem of the destiny of all the Turks, a man perhaps would jostle against his camel and whisper encouragements. But nothing ever came of the encouragements. He saw the sun rise daily beyond the bend of the river, behind the tall palm trees of Khartoum, and burn across the sky, and the months dragged one after the other. On an evening towards the end of August, in that year when Durrance came home blind from the Sudan, he sat in a corner of the enclosure watching the sun drop westward towards the plain with an agony of anticipation. For however intolerable the heat and burden of the day, it was as nothing compared with the horrors which each night renewed. The moment of twilight came, and with it Idris-e-Sair, the great Negro of the Gawama tribe, and his fellow jailers. "Into the House of Stone!" he cried. Praying and cursing, with the sound of the pitiless whips falling perpetually upon the backs of the hindmost, the prisoners jostled and struggled at the narrow entrance to the prison house. Already it was occupied by some 30 captives, lying upon the swamped mud floor, or supported against the wall in the last extremities of weakness and disease. 200 more were driven in at night and pinned there till morning. The room was perhaps 30 feet square, of which 4 feet were occupied by a solid pillar supporting the roof. There was no window in the building. A few small apertures near the roof made a pretence of giving air, and into this foul and pestilent hovel the prisoners were packed, screaming and fighting. The door was closed upon them. Utter darkness replaced the twilight, so that a man could not distinguish even the outlines of the heads of the neighbors who wedged him in. Colonel Trench fought like the rest. There was a corner near the door which he coveted at that moment with a greater fierceness of desire than he had ever felt in the days when he had been free. Once in that corner, he would have some shelter from the blows, the stamping feet, the bruises of his neighbour's shackles. He would have, too, a support against which to lean his back during the 10 interminable hours of suffocation. If I were to fall, if I were to fall! That fear was always with him when he was driven in at night. It worked in him like a drug, producing madness. For if a man once went down amid that yelling, struggling throng, he never got up again. He was trampled out of shape. Trench had seen such victims dragged from the prison each morning, and he was a small man. Therefore he fought for his corner in a frenzy like a wild beast, kicking with his fetters, thrusting with his elbows, diving under this big man's arm, burrowing between 2 others, tearing at their clothes, using his nails, his fists, and even striking at heads with the chain which dangled from the iron ring about his neck. He reached the corner in the end, streaming with heat and gasping for breath. The rest of the night he would spend in holding it against all comers. "If I were to fall," he gasped, "oh God, if I were to fall!" And he shouted aloud to his neighbour, for in that clamour nothing less than a shout was audible. "Is it you, Ibrahim?" And a like shout answered him, "Yes, Effendi." Trench felt some relief. Between Ibrahim, a great tall Arab of the Hadendoas, and Trench, a friendship born of their common necessity had sprung up. There were no prison rations at Omdurman. Each captive was dependent upon his own money or the charity of his friends outside. To Trench from time to time there came money from his friends, brought secretly into the prison by a native who had come up from Assouan or Suakin. But there were long periods during which no help came to him, and he lived upon the charity of the Greeks who had sworn conversion to the Mahdist faith, or starved with such patience as he could. There were times, too, when Ibrahim had no friend to send him his meal into the prison, and thus each man helped the other in his need. They stood side by side against the wall at night. "Yes, Effendi, I am here." And groping with his hand in the black darkness, he steadied Trench against the wall. A fight of even more than common violence was raging in an extreme corner of the prison, and so closely packed were the prisoners that with each advance of one combatant and retreat of the other, the whole jostled crowd swayed in a sort of rhythm, from end to end, from side to side, but they swayed, fighting to keep their feet, fighting even with their teeth, and above the din and noise of their hard breathing, the clank of their chains, and their imprecations, there rose now and then a wild sobbing cry for mercy, or an inhuman shriek, stifled as soon as uttered, which showed that a man had gone down beneath the stamping feet. Missiles, too, were flung across the prison, even to the foul earth gathered from the floor, and since none knew from what quarter they were flung, heads were battered against heads in the effort to avoid them, and all these things happened in the blackest darkness. For 2 hours Trench stood in that black prison, ringing with noise, rank with heat, and there were 8 hours to follow before the door would be opened and he could stumble into the clean air and fall asleep in the zareeba. He stood upon tiptoe, that he might lift his head above his fellows, but even so he could barely breathe, and the air he breathed was moist and sour. His throat was parched, his tongue was swollen in his mouth and stringy like a dried fig. It seemed to him that the imagination of God could devise no worse hell than the house of stone on an August night in Omdurman. It could add fire, he thought, but only fire. "If I were to fall!" he cried, and as he spoke his hell was made perfect, for the door was opened. Idris es Saier appeared in the opening. "Make room!" he cried, "make room!" and he threw fire among the prisoners to drive them from the door. Lighted turfs of dried grass blazed in the darkness, and they fell upon the bodies of the prisoners. The captives were so crowded they could not avoid the missiles. In places even they could not lift their hands to dislodge them from their shoulders or their heads. "Make room!" cried Idris. The whips of his fellow jailers enforced his command. The lashes fell upon all within reach, and a little space was cleared within the door. Into that space a man was flung, and the door closed again. Trench was standing close to the door. In the dim twilight which came through the doorway he had caught a glimpse of the new prisoner, a man heavily ironed, slight of figure, and bent with suffering. "He will fall," he said. "He will fall tonight. God, if I were to—" And suddenly the crowd swayed against him, and the curses rose louder and shriller than before. The new prisoner was the cause. He clung to the door with his face against the panels, through the chinks of which actual air might come. Those behind plucked him from his vantage, jostled him, pressed him backwards that they might take his place. He was driven, as a wedge is driven by a hammer, between this prisoner and that, until at last he was flung against Colonel Trench. The ordinary instincts of kindness could not live in the nightmare of that prison house. In the daytime, outside, the prisoners were often drawn together by their bond of a common misery. The faithful, as often as not, helped the infidel. But to fight for life during the hours of darkness, without pity or cessation, was the one creed and practice of the House of Stone. Colonel Trench was like the rest. The need to live, if only long enough to drink one drop of water in the morning and draw one clean mouthful of fresh air, was more than uppermost in his mind. It was the only thought he had. "Back!" he cried violently. "Back, or I strike!" And as he wrestled to lift his arm above his head that he might strike the better, he heard the man who had been flung against him incoherently babbling English. "Don't fall!" cried Trench, and he caught his fellow captive by the arm. "Ibrahim, help! God, if he were to fall!" And while the crowd swayed again, and the shrill cries and curses rose again, deafening the ears, piercing the brain, Trench supported his companion, and bending down his head, caught again, after so many months, the accent of his own tongue, and the sound of it civilized him like the friendship of a woman. He could not hear what was said, the din was too loud, but he caught, as it were, shadows of words which had once been familiar to him, which had been spoken to him, which he had spoken to others as a matter of course. In the House of Stone they sounded most wonderful. They had a magic too. Meadows of grass, cool skies, and limpid rivers rose in grey quiet pictures before his mind. For a moment he was insensible to his parched throat, to the stench of that prison house, to the oppressive blackness. But he felt the man whom he supported totter and slip, and again he cried to Ibrahim. If he were to fall! Ibrahim helped as only he could. Together they fought and wrestled until those about them yielded, crying, "Shaitan, they are mad!" They cleared a space in that corner, and setting the Englishman down upon the ground, they stood in front of him lest he should be trampled, and behind him on the ground Trench heard every now and then, in a lull of the noise, the babble of English. "He will die before morning," he cried to Ibrahim. "He is in a fever." "Sit beside him," said the Hadendoa. "I can keep them back." Trench stooped and squatted in the corner. Ibrahim set his legs well apart and guarded Trench and his new friend. Bending his head, Trench could now hear the words. They were the words of a man in delirium, spoken in a voice of great pleading. He was telling some tale of the sea, it seemed. "I saw the riding lights of the yacht, and the reflections shortening and lengthening as the water rippled. There was a band, too, as we passed the pier head. What was it playing? Not the overture, and I don't think that I remember any other tune." And he laughed with a crazy chuckle. "I was always pretty bad at appreciating music, wasn't I? Except when you played." And again he came back to the sea. "There was the line of hills upon the right as the boat steamed out of the bay. You remember, there were woods on the hillside. Perhaps you have forgotten. Then came Bray, a little fairyland of lights, close down by the water, at the point of the ridge. You remember Bray? We lunched there once or twice, just you and I, before everything was settled. It seems strange to be steaming out of Dublin Bay and leaving you a long way off to the north, among the hills. Strange, and somehow not quite right. For that was the word you used when the morning came behind the blinds. It is not right that one should suffer so much pain. The engines didn't stop, though. They just kept throbbing and revolving and clanking, as though nothing had happened whatever. One felt a little angry about that. The fairyland was already only a sort of golden blob behind, and then nothing but sea and the salt wind and the things to be done. The man in his delirium suddenly lifted himself upon an elbow, and with the other hand fumbled in his breast as though he searched for something. "Yes, the things to be done," he repeated in a mumbling voice, and he sank to unintelligible whisperings, with his head fallen upon his breast. Trench put an arm about him and raised him up, but he could do nothing more, and even to him, crouched as he was close to the ground, the noisome heat was almost beyond endurance. In front, the din of shrill voices, the screams for pity, the swaying and struggling went on in that appalling darkness. In one corner there were men singing in a mad frenzy. In another a few danced in their fetters, or rather tried to dance. In front of Trench Ibrahim maintained his guard, and beside Trench there lay in the house of stone, in the town beyond the world, a man who one night had sailed out of Dublin Bay, past the riding lanterns of the yachts, and had seen Bray, that fairyland of lights, dwindling to a golden blob. To think of the sea and the salt wind, the sparkle of lights as the water split at the ship's bows, the illuminated deck, perhaps the sound of a bell telling the hour, and the cool dim night about and above, so wrought upon Trench that, practical, unimaginative creature as he was, for very yearning he could have wept. But the stranger at his side began to speak again. "It is funny that those three faces were always the same, the man in the tent with the lancet in his hand, and the man in the back room off Piccadilly, and mine. Funny and not quite right. No, I don't think that was quite right either. They get quite big, too, just when you are going to sleep in the dark, quite big, and they come very close to you and won't go away. They rather frighten one." And he suddenly clung to Trench with a close nervous grip, like a boy in an extremity of fear. And it was in the tone of reassurance that a man might use to a boy that Trench replied, "It's all right, old man, it's all right." But Trench's companion was already relieved of his fear. He had come out of his boyhood, and was rehearsing some interview which was to take place in the future. "Will you take it back?" he asked, with a great deal of hesitation and timidity. "Really?" "The others have, all except the man who died at Tamai. And you will too?" He spoke as though he could hardly believe some piece of great good fortune which had befallen him. Then his voice changed to that of a man belittling his misfortunes. "Oh, it hasn't been the best of times, of course. But then one didn't expect the best of times. And at the worst one always had the afterwards to look forward to. Supposing one didn't run, I'm not sure that when the whole thing's balanced it won't come out that you have really had the worst time. I know you. It would hurt you through and through, pride and heart and everything, for a long time, just as much as it hurt that morning when the daylight came through the blinds, and you couldn't do anything. And you haven't the afterward to help you. You weren't looking forward to it all the time as I was. It was all over and done with for you." And he lapsed again into mutterings. Colonel Trench's delight at the sound of his native tongue had now given place to a great curiosity as to the man who spoke and what he said. Trench had described himself a long while ago, as he stood opposite the cab-stand in the southwest corner of St. James's Square. "I am an inquisitive, methodical person," he had said, and he had not described himself amiss. Here was a life history, it seemed, being unfolded to his ears, and not the happiest of histories, perhaps, indeed, with something of tragedy at the heart of it. Trench began to speculate upon the meaning of that word "afterwards," which came and went among the words like the motif in a piece of music, and very likely it was the life motif of the man who spoke them. In the prison the heat became stifling, the darkness more oppressive, but the cries and shouts were dying down. Their volume was less great, their intonations less shrill. Stupor and fatigue and exhaustion were having their effect. Trench bent his head again to his companion, and now heard more clearly. "I saw your light that morning. You put it out suddenly. Did you hear my step on the gravel? I thought you did. It hurt rather." And then he broke out into an emphatic protest. "No, no, I had no idea that you would wait. I had no wish that you should. Afterwards, perhaps, I thought, but nothing more. Upon my word, Sutch was quite wrong. Of course, there was always the chance that one might come to grief oneself, get killed, you know, or fall ill and die, before one asked you to take your feather back, and then there wouldn't even have been a chance of the afterwards. But that is the risk one had to take." The allusion was not direct enough for Colonel Trench's comprehension. He heard the word "feather," but he could not connect it as yet with any action of his own. He was more curious than ever about that afterwards. He began to have a glimmering of its meaning, and he was struck with wonderment at the thought of how many men there were going about the world with a calm and commonplace demeanour, beneath which were hidden quaint fancies and poetic beliefs, never to be so much as suspected until illness deprived the brain of its control. "No, one of the reasons why I never said anything that night to you about what I intended was, I think, that I did not wish you to wait or have any suspicion of what I was going to attempt." And then expostulation ceased, and he began to speak in a tone of interest. "Do you know, it has only occurred to me since I came to the Sudan, but I believe that Durrance cared." The name came with something of a shock upon Trench's ears. The man knew Durrance. He was not merely a stranger of Trench's blood, but he knew Durrance, even as Trench knew him. There was a link between them. They had a friend in common. He knew Durrance, had fought in the same square with him perhaps, at Tokar or Tamai or Tamanib, just as Trench had done. And so Trench's curiosity as to the life history in its turn gave place to a curiosity as to the identity of the man. He tried to see, knowing that in that black and noisome hovel sight was impossible. He might hear, though, enough to be assured, for if the stranger knew Durrance, it might be that he knew Trench as well. Trench listened. The sound of the voice, high-pitched and rambling, told him nothing. He waited for the words, and the words came. "Durrance stood at the window after I had told them about you, Ethne." And Trench repeated the name to himself. It was to a woman, then, that his new-found compatriot, this friend of Durrance, in his delirium imagined himself to be speaking. A woman named Ethne. Trench could recall no such name, but the voice in the dark went on. "All the time when I was proposing to send in my papers, after the telegram had come, he stood at the window of my rooms, with his back to me, looking out across the park. I fancied he blamed me, but I think now he was making up his mind to lose you. I wonder." Trench uttered so startled an exclamation that Ibrahim turned around. "Is he dead?" "No, he lives, he lives." It was impossible, Trench argued. He remembered quite clearly Durrance standing by a window with his back to the room. He remembered a telegram coming, which took a long while in the reading, which diffused among all except Durrance an inexplicable suspense. He remembered, too, a man who spoke of his betrothal, and of sending in his papers. But surely this could not be the man. Was the woman's name Ethne? A woman of Donegal, yes. And this man had spoken of sailing out of Dublin Bay. He had spoken, too, of a feather. "Good God," whispered Trench. "Was the name Ethne? Was it? Was it?" But for a while he received no answer. He heard only talk of a mud-walled city, and an intolerable sun burning upon a wide round of desert, and a man who lay there all day with his linen robe drawn over his head, and slowly drew one face toward him across 3,000 miles, until at sunset it was near, and he took courage and went down into the gate. And after that 4 words stabbed Trench. 3 little white feathers were the words. Trench leaned back against the wall. It was he who had devised that message. 3 little white feathers, the voice repeated. "This afternoon we were under the elms down by the Lennon River. Do you remember, Harry, just you and I? And then came 3 little white feathers, and the world's at an end." Trench had no longer any doubts. The man was quoting words and words, no doubt spoken by this girl Ethne, on the night when the 3 feathers came. "Harry," she had said. "Do you remember, Harry?" Trench was certain. "Feversham!" he cried. "Feversham!" And he shook the man whom he held in his arms and called to him again. Under the elms by the Lennon River, visions of green shade touched with gold and of the sunlight flickering between the leaves caught at Trench, and drew him like a mirage in that desert of which Feversham had spoken. Feversham had been under the elms of the Lennon River on that afternoon before the feathers came, and he was in the house of stone at Omdurman. But why? Trench asked himself the question, and was not spared the answer. Willoughby took his feather back, and upon that Feversham broke off. His voice rambled. He seemed to be running somewhere amid sandhills which continually shifted and danced about him as he ran, so that he could not tell which way he went. He was in the last stage of fatigue, too, so that his voice in his delirium became querulous and weak. "Abu Fatma!" he cried, and the cry was the cry of a man whose throat is parched and whose limbs fail beneath him. "Abu Fatma! Abu Fatma!" He stumbled as he ran, picked himself up, ran and stumbled again, and about him the deep soft sand piled itself into pyramids, built itself into long slopes and ridges, and levelled itself flat with an extraordinary and a malicious rapidity. "Abu Fatma!" cried Feversham, and he began to argue in a weak, obstinate voice. I know the wells are here, close by, within half a mile. I know they are. I know they are." The clue to that speech Trench had not got. He knew nothing of Feversham's adventure at Berber. He could not tell that the wells were the wells of Obak, or that Feversham, tired with the hurry of his travelling, and after a long day's march without water, had lost his way among the shifting sandhills. But he did know that Willoughby had taken back his feather, and he made a guess as to the motive which had brought Feversham now to the House of Stone. Even on that point, however, he was not to remain in doubt, for in a while he heard his own name upon Feversham's lips. Remorse seized upon Colonel Trench. The sending of the feathers had been his invention and his alone. He could not thrust the responsibility of his invention upon either Willoughby or Castleton. It was just his doing. He had thought it rather a shrewd and clever stroke, he remembered at the time, a vengeance eminently just. Eminently just, no doubt it was, but he had not thought of the woman. He had not imagined that she might be present when the feathers came. He had indeed almost forgotten the episode. He had never speculated upon the consequences, and now they rose up and smote the smiter. And his remorse was to grow, for the night was not nearly at its end. All through the dark, slow hours he supported Feversham and heard him talk. Now Feversham was lurking in the bazaar at Suakin, and during the siege. During the siege, thought Trench. While we were there, then, he was herding with the camel drivers in the bazaar, learning their tongues, watching for his chance. 3 years of it. At another moment Feversham was slinking up the Nile to Wadi Halfa with a zither, in the company of some itinerant musicians, hiding from any who might remember him and accuse him with his name. Trench heard of a man slipping out from Wadi Halfa, crossing the Nile, and wandering with the assumed manner of a lunatic southwards, starving and waterless, until one day he was snapped up by a modest caravan and dragged to Dongola as a spy. And at Dongola things had happened of which the mere mention made Trench shake. He heard of leather cords which had been bound about the prisoner's wrist, and upon which water had been poured until the cords swelled and the wrist burst. But this was among the minor brutalities. Trench waited for the morning as he listened, wondering whether indeed it would ever come. He heard the bolts dragged back at the last. He saw the door open and the good daylight. He stood up, and with Ibrahim's help protected this new comrade until the eager rush was past. Then he supported him out into the zareeba, worn, wasted in body and face, with a rough beard straggled upon his chin, and his eyes all sunk and very bright. It was still Harry Feversham. Trench laid him down in a corner of the zareeba where there would be shade, and in a few hours shade would be needed. Then, with the rest, he scrambled to the Nile for water and brought it back. As he poured it down Feversham's throat, Feversham seemed for a moment to recognize him, but it was only for a moment, and the incoherent tale of his adventures began again. Thus, after 5 years, and for the first time since Trench had dined as Feversham's guest in the high rooms overlooking St. James's Park, the two men met in the House of Stone. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Oldman. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Plans of Escape. For 3 days Feversham rambled and wandered in his talk, and for 3 days Trench fetched him water from the Nile, shared his food with him, and ministered to his wants. For 3 nights, too, he stood with Ibrahim and fought in front of Feversham in the House of Stone. But on the fourth morning Feversham waked to his senses and, looking up with his own eyes, saw bending over him the face of Trench. At first the face seemed part of his delirium. It was one of those nightmare faces which had used to grow big and had come so horribly close to him in the dark nights of his boyhood as he lay in bed. He put out a weak arm and thrust it aside, but he gazed about him. He was lying in the shadow of the prison house, and the hard blue sky above him, the brown bare trampled soil on which he lay, and the figures of his fellow prisoners, dragging their chains or lying prone upon the ground in some extremity of sickness, gradually conveyed their meaning to him. He turned to Trench, caught at him as if he feared the next moment would snatch him out of reach, and then he smiled. "I am in the prison at Omdurman," he said. "Actually in the prison. This is Haga, the House of Stone. It seems too good to be true." He leaned back against the wall with an air of extreme relief. To Trench the words, the tone of satisfaction in which they were uttered, sounded like some sardonic piece of irony. A man who plumed himself upon indifference to pain and pleasure, who posed as a being of so much experience that joy and trouble could no longer stir a pulse or cause a frown, and who carried his pose to perfection. Such a man, thought Trench, might have uttered Feversham's words in Feversham's voice, but Feversham was not that man. His delirium had proved it. The satisfaction, then, was genuine, the words sincere. The peril of Dongola was past. He had found Trench. He was in Omdurman. That prison house was his longed-for goal, and he had reached it. He might have been dangling on a gibbet hundreds of miles away, down the stream of the Nile, with the vultures perched upon his shoulders, the purpose for which he lived quite unfulfilled. But he was in the enclosure of the House of Stone in Omdurman. "You have been here a long while?" he said. 3 years. Feversham looked round the zareeba. 3 years of it," he murmured. "I was afraid that I might not find you alive." Trench nodded. "The nights are the worst. The nights in here. It's a wonder any man lives through a week of them. Yet I have lived through 1,000 nights, and even to him who had endured them his endurance seemed incredible." 1,000 nights in the House of Stone!" he exclaimed. "But we may go down to the Nile by daytime," said Feversham, and he started up with alarm as he gazed at the thorn zareeba. "Surely we are allowed so much liberty?" "I was told so. An Arab at Wadi Halfa told me." "And it's true," returned Trench. "Look." He pointed to the earthen bowl of water at his side. "I filled that at the Nile this morning." "I must go," said Feversham, and he lifted himself up from the ground. "I must go this morning," and since he spoke with a raised voice and a manner of excitement, Trench whispered to him: "Hush! There are many prisoners here, and among them many talebearers." Feversham sank back on to the ground, as much from weakness as in obedience to Trench's warning. "But they cannot understand what we say," he objected in a voice from which the excitement had suddenly gone. "They can see that we talk together and earnestly. Idris would know of it within the hour. The Khalifa before sunset. There would be heavier fetters, and the courbatch if we spoke at all. Lie still. You are weak, and I too am very tired. We will sleep, and later in the day we will go together down to the Nile." Trench lay down beside Feversham, and in a moment was asleep. Feversham watched him, and saw, now that his features were relaxed, the marks of those 3 years very plainly in his face. It was towards noon before he awoke. "There is no one to bring you food?" he asked, and Feversham answered: "Yes, a boy should come. He should bring news as well." They waited until the gate of the zareeba was opened, and the friends or wives of the prisoners entered. At once that enclosure became a cage of wild beasts. The gaolers took their dole at the outset. Little more of the asida, that moist and pounded bread of durra which was the staple diet of the town, than was sufficient to support life was allowed to reach the prisoners, and even for that the strong fought with the weak, and the group of 4 did battle with the group of 3. From every corner men gaunt and thin as skeletons hopped and leaped as quickly as the weight of their chains would allow them towards the entrance. Here one weak with starvation tripped and fell, and once fallen lay prone in stolid despair, knowing that for him there would be no meal that day. Others seized upon the messengers who brought the food and tore it from their hands, though the whips of the gaolers laid their backs open. There were 30 gaolers to guard that enclosure, each armed with his rhinoceros hide courbatch. But this was the one moment in each day when the courbatch was neither feared nor, as it seemed, felt. Among the food bearers a boy sheltered himself behind the rest and gazed irresolutely about the zareeba. It was not long, however, before he was detected. He was knocked down and his food snatched from his hands. But the boy had his lungs, and his screams brought Idris Essayah himself upon the 3 men who had attacked him. "For whom do you come?" he asked Idris, as he thrust the prisoners aside. "For Giuseppe, the Greek," answered the boy, and as Idris pointed to the corner where Feversham lay, the boy advanced, holding out his empty hands as though explaining how it was that he brought no food. But he came quite close, and squatting at Feversham's side, continued to explain with words. And as he spoke he loosed a gazelle skin which was fastened about his waist beneath his jibbeh, and he let it fall by Feversham's side. The gazelle skin contained a chicken, and upon that Feversham and Trench breakfasted and dined and supped. An hour later they were allowed to pass out of the zareeba and make their way to the Nile. They walked slowly and with many halts, and during one of these Trench said, "We can talk here." Below them, at the water's edge, some of the prisoners were unloading dhows. Others were paddling knee-deep in the muddy water. The shore was crowded with men screaming and shouting and excited for no reason whatever. The gaolers were within view, but not within earshot. "Yes, we can talk here. Why have you come?" "I was captured in the desert on the Arbain road," said Feversham slowly. "Yes, masquerading as a lunatic musician who had wandered out of the Wadi Halfa with a zither. I know. But you were captured by your own deliberate wish. You came to join me in Omdurman. I know." "How do you know?" "You told me. During the last 3 days you have told me much." And Feversham looked about him suddenly in alarm. "Very much," continued Trench. "You came to join me because 5 years ago I sent you a white feather." "And was that all I told you?" asked Feversham anxiously. "No," Trench replied, and he dragged out the word. He sat up while Feversham lay on his side, and he looked towards the Nile in front of him, holding his head between his hands, so that he could not see or be seen by Feversham. "No, that was not all. You spoke of a girl, the same girl of whom you spoke when Willoughby and Durrance and I dined with you in London a long while ago." "I know her name now, her Christian name." "She was with you when the feathers came?" "I had not thought of that possibility." "She gave you a 4th feather to add to our 3? I am sorry." There was a silence of some length, and then Feversham replied slowly, "For my part I am not sorry. I mean I am not sorry that she was present when the feathers came. I think, on the whole, that I am rather glad. She gave me the 4th feather, it is true, but I am glad of that as well. For without her presence, without that 4th feather snapped from her fan, I might have given up there and then. Who knows? I doubt if I could have stood up to the 3 long years in Suakin. I used to see you and Durrance and Willoughby and many men who had once been my friends, and you were all going about the work which I was used to. You can't think how the mere routine of a regiment to which one had become accustomed, and which one cursed heartily enough when one had to put up with it, appealed as something very desirable. I could so easily have slipped on to a boat and gone back to Suez, and the chance for which I waited never came, for 3 years." "You saw us," said Trench, "and you gave no sign. How would you have taken it, if I had?" And Trench was silent. "No, I saw you, but I was careful that you should not see me. I doubt if I could have endured it without the recollection of that night at Ramelton, without the feel of the fourth feather to keep the recollection actual and recent in my thoughts. I should never have gone down from Obak into Berber. I should certainly never have joined you in Omdurman." Trench turned quickly towards his companion. "She would be glad to hear you say that," he said. "I have no doubt she is sorry about her fourth feather, sorry as I am about the other 3. There is no reason that she should be, or that you either should be sorry. I don't blame you or her." And in his turn Feversham was silent and looked towards the river. The air was shrill with cries. The shore was thronged with a motley of Arabs and Negroes, dressed in their long robes of blue and yellow and dirty brown. The work of unloading the dhows went busily on. Across the river and beyond its fork the palm trees of Khartoum stood up against the cloudless sky, and the sun behind them was moving down to the west. In a few hours would come the horrors of the House of Stone. But they were both thinking of the elms by the Lennon River, and a hall of which the door stood open to the cool night and which echoed softly to the music of a waltz, while a girl and a man stood with 3 white feathers fallen upon the floor between them. The one man recollected, the other imagined the picture, and to both of them it was equally vivid. Feversham smiled at last. "Perhaps she has now seen Willoughby. Perhaps she has now taken his feather." Trench held out his hand to his companion. "I will take mine back now." Feversham shook his head. "No, not yet," and Trench's face suddenly lighted up. A hope which had struggled up in his hopeless breast during the next 3 days and nights of his watch, a hope which he had striven to repress, for very fear lest it might prove false, sprang to life. "Not yet? Then you have a plan for our escape?" And the anxiety returned to Feversham's face. "I said nothing of it," he pleaded. "Tell me that. When I was delirious in a prison there, I said nothing of it. I breathed no word of it. I told you of the 4 feathers. I told you of Ethne. But of the plan for your escape I said nothing. Not a single word, so that I myself was in doubt and did not dare to believe." And Feversham's anxiety died away. He had spoken with his hand trembling upon Trench's arm, and his voice itself had trembled with alarm. "You see, if I spoke of that in the House of Stone," he exclaimed, "I might have spoken of it in Dongola. For in Dongola, as well as Omdurman, I was delirious. But I didn't, you say. Not here, at all events. So perhaps not there either. I was afraid that I should. How I was afraid! There was a woman in Dongola who spoke some English, very little, but enough. She had been in Kornisa of Khartoum when Gordon ruled there. She was sent to question me. I had unhappy times in Dongola." Trench interrupted him in a low voice. "I know. You told me things which made me shiver," and he caught hold of Feversham's arm and thrust the loose sleeve back. Feversham's scarred wrists confirmed the tale. "Well, I felt myself getting light-headed there," he went on. "I made up my mind that of your escape I must let no hint slip. So I tried to think of something else with all my might, when I was going off my head." And he laughed a little to himself. "That was why you heard me talk of Ethne," he explained. Trench sat nursing his knees and looking straight in front of him. He had paid no heed to Feversham's last words. He had dared now to give his hopes their way. "So it's true," he said in a quiet, wondering voice. "There will be a morning when we shall not drag ourselves out of the House of Stone. There will be nights when we shall sleep in beds, actually in beds. There will be—" He stopped with a sort of shy air like a man upon the brink of a confession. "There will be something more," he said lamely, and then he got up on to his feet. "We have sat here too long. Let us go forward." They moved 100 yards nearer to the river and sat down again. "You have more than a hope. You have a plan of escape?" Trench asked eagerly. "More than a plan," returned Feversham. "The preparations are made. There are camels waiting in the desert 10 miles west of Omdurman." "Now?" exclaimed Trench. "Now?" "Yes, man, now. There are rifles and ammunition buried near the camels, provisions and water kept in readiness. We travel by Metemmeh, where fresh camels wait, from Metemmeh to Berber. There we will cross the Nile. Camels are waiting for us 5 miles from Berber. From Berber we ride in over the Kokreb pass to Suakin." "When?" exclaimed Trench. "Oh, when? When?" "When I have strength enough to sit a horse for 10 miles, and a camel for a week," answered Feversham. "How soon will that be?" "Not long, Trench, I promise you, not long," and he rose up from the ground. "As you get up," he continued, "glance around. You will see a man in a blue linen dress loitering between us and the goal. As we came past me he made me a sign. I did not return it. I shall return it on a day when we escape. He will wait for a month. We must manage on one night during that month to escape from the House of Stone. We can signal him to bring help. A passage might be made in one night through that wall. The stones are loosely built." They walked a little further and came to the water's edge. There, amid the crowd, they spoke again of their escape, but with the air of men amused at what went on about them. "There is a better way than breaking through the wall," said Trench, and he uttered a laugh as he spoke, and pointed to a prisoner with a great load upon his back, who had fallen upon his face in the water, and encumbered by his fetters, pressed down by his load, was vainly struggling to lift himself again. "There is a better way. You have money?" "Aye, aye," shouted Feversham, roaring with laughter, as the prisoner half rose and soused again. "I have some concealed on me. Idris took what I did not conceal." "Good," said Trench. "Idris will come to you today or tomorrow. He will talk to you of the goodness of Allah, who has brought you out of the wickedness of the world to the holy city of Omdurman. He will tell you at great length of the peril of your soul and of the only means of averting it, and he will wind up with a few significant sentences about his starving family. If you come to the aid of his starving family and bid him keep for himself $15 out of the amount he took from you, he may get permission to sleep in the zareeba outside the prison. Be content with that for a night or two. Then he will come to you again, and again you assist his starving family, and this time you will ask for permission for me to sleep in the open too. Come, there's Irdus shepherding us home." It fell out as Trench had predicted. Irdus read Feversham an abnormally long lecture that afternoon. Feversham learned that now God loved him, and how Hicks Pasha's army had been destroyed. The holy angels had done that. Not a single shot was fired, not a single spear thrown by the Mahdi's soldiers. The spears flew from their hands by the angels' guidance and pierced the unbelievers. Feversham heard for the first time of a most convenient spirit, Nebi Kedar, who was the Caliph's eyes and ears, and reported to him all that went on in the goal. It was pointed out to Feversham that if Nebi Kedar reported against him, he would have heavier shackles riveted upon his feet, and many unpleasant things would happen. At last came the exordium about the starving children, and Feversham begged Irdus to take $15. Trench's plan succeeded. That night Feversham slept in the open, and 2 nights later Trench lay down beside him. Overhead was a clear sky and the blazing stars. "Only 3 more days," said Feversham, and he heard his companion draw in a long breath. For a while they lay side by side in silence. breathing the cool night air, and then Trench said, "Are you awake?" "Yes." Well, with some hesitation he made that confidence which he had repressed on the day when they sat upon the foreshore of the Nile. "Each man has his particular weak spots of sentiment, I suppose. I have mine. I am not a marrying man, so it's not sentiment of that kind. Perhaps you will laugh at it. It isn't merely that I loathe his squalid, shadeless, vile town of Omdurman, or the horrors of its prison. It isn't merely that I hate the emptiness of those desert wastes. It isn't merely that I am sick of the palm trees of Khartoum, or these chains, or the whips of the gaolers. But there's something more. I want to die at home. I have been desperately afraid so often that I should die here. I want to die at home, not merely in my own country, but in my own village, and be buried there under the trees. I know, in the sight of the church and the houses, I know, and the trout stream where I fished when I was a boy. You'll laugh, no doubt." Feversham was not laughing. The words had a queer ring of familiarity to him, and he knew why. They never had actually been spoken to him, but they might have been, and by Ethne Eustace. "No, I am not laughing," he answered. "I understand." And he spoke with a warmth of tone which rather surprised Trench. And indeed an actual friendship sprang up between the two men, and it dated from that night. It was a fit moment for confidences. Lying side by side in that enclosure, they made them one to the other in low voices. The shouts and yells came muffled from within the house of stone, and gave to them both a feeling that they were well off. They could breathe. They could see. No low roof oppressed them. They were in the cool of the night air. That night air would be very cold before morning, and wake them to shiver in their rags and huddle together in their corner. But at present they lay comfortably upon their backs, and with their hands clasped behind their heads, and watched the great stars and planets burn in the blue dome of sky. "It will be strange to find them dim and small again," said Trench. "There will be compensations," answered Feversham, with a laugh, and they fell to making plans of what they would do when they had crossed the desert and the Mediterranean and the continent of Europe, and had come to their own country of dim small stars. Fascinated and enthralled by the pictures which the simplest sentence, the most commonplace phrase, through the magic of its associations, was able to evoke in their minds, they let the hours slip by unnoticed. They were no longer prisoners in that barbarous town which lay a murky stain upon the solitary wide spaces of sand. They were in their own land, following their old pursuits. They were standing outside clumps of trees, guns in their hands, while a sharp cry, "Mark! Mark!" came to their ears. Trench heard again the unmistakable rattle of the reel of his fishing rod as he wound in his line upon the bank of his trout stream. They talked of theatres in London, and the last plays which they had seen, the last books which they had read 6 years ago. "There goes the Great Bear," said Trench suddenly. "It is late." The tail of the constellation was dipping behind the thorn hedge of the zareeba. They turned over on their sides. 3 more days," said Trench. "Only 3 more days," Feversham replied, and in a minute they were neither in England nor the Soudan. The stars marched to the morning unnoticed above their head. They were lost in the pleasant countries of sleep. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Oldman. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Colonel Trench assumes a knowledge of chemistry. 3 more days." Both men fell asleep with these words upon their lips. But the next morning Trench waked up and complained of a fever, and the fever rapidly gained upon him, so that before the afternoon had come he was lightheaded, and those services which he had performed for Feversham had now to perform for him. The 1,000 Knights of the House of Stone had done their work, but it was no mere coincidence that Trench should suddenly be struck down by them at the very moment when the door of his prison was opening. The great revulsion of joy, which had come to him so unexpectedly, had been too much for his exhausted body. The actual prospect of escape had been the crowning trial which he could not endure. "In a few days he will be well," said Feversham. "It is nothing." "It is unsabba," answered Ibrahim, shaking his head. "The terrible typhus fever which has struck down so many in that infected gaol, and carried them off upon the 7th day." Feversham refused to believe. "It is nothing," he repeated in a sort of passionate obstinacy. But in his mind there ran another question. Will the men with the camels wait? Each day as he went to the Nile he saw Abou Fatma in the blue robe at his post. Each day the man made a sign, and each day Feversham gave him no answer. Meanwhile, with Ibrahim's help, he nursed Trench. The boy came daily to the prison with food. He was sent out to buy tamarinds, dates, and roots, out of which Ibrahim brewed cooling draughts. Together they carried Trench from shade to shade as the sun moved across the Zareeba. Some further assistance was provided for the starving family of Idris, and the 40-pound chains which Trench wore were consequently removed. He was given vegetable marrow soaked in salt water. His mouth was packed with butter, his body anointed and wrapped close in camel cloths. The fever took its course, and on the 7th day Ibrahim said, "This is the last. Tonight he will die." "No," replied Feversham, "that is impossible." "In his own parish," he said, "beneath the trees he knew, not here." "No," and he spoke again with a passionate obstinacy. He was no longer thinking of the man in the blue robe outside the prison walls, or of the chances of escape. The fear that the 3rd feather would never be brought back to Ethne, that he would never have the opportunity to take back the 4th of her own free will, no longer troubled him. Even that great hope of the afterwards was, for the moment, banished from his mind. He thought only of Trench and the few awkward words he had spoken in a corner of the Zareeba, on the first night when they lay side by side under the sky. "No," he repeated, "he must not die here." And through all that day and night he watched by Trench's side the long hard battle between life and death. At one moment it seemed that the 3 years of the House of Stone must win the victory, at another that Trench's strong constitution and wiry frame would get the better of the 3 years. For that night, at all events, they did, and the struggle was prolonged. The dangerous 7th day was past. Even Ibrahim began to gain hope, and on the 13th day Trench slept and did not ramble during his sleep, and when he waked it was with a clear head. He found himself alone, and so swathed in camel cloth that he could not stir. But the heat of day was past, and the shadow of the House of Stone lay black upon the sand of the Zareeba. He had not any wish to stir, and he lay wondering idly how long he had been ill. While he wondered, he heard the shouts of the gaolers and the cries of the prisoners outside the Zareeba and in the direction of the river. The gate was opened, and the prisoners flocked in. Feversham was among them, and he walked straight to Trench's corner. "Thank God," he cried. "I would not have left you, but I was compelled. We have been unloading boats all day," and he dropped in fatigue by Trench's side. "How long have I lain ill?" asked Trench. 13 days. "It will be a month before I can travel. You must go, Feversham. You must leave me here and go while you still can. Perhaps when you come to Assouan you can do something for me. I could not move at the present." "You will go tomorrow?" "No, I should not go without you in any case," answered Feversham. "As it is too late." "Too late?" Trench repeated. He took in the meaning of the words but slowly. He was almost reluctant to be disturbed by their mere sound. He wished just to lie idle for a long time in the cool of the sunset. But gradually the import of what Feversham had said forced itself into his mind. "Too late? Then the man in the blue gown has gone?" "Yes. He spoke to me yesterday by the river. The camel men would wait no longer. They were afraid of detection, and meant to return whether we went with them or not." "You should have gone with them," said Trench. For himself he did not at that moment care whether he was to live in the prison all his life, so long as he was allowed quietly to lie where he was for a long time. And it was without expression of despair that he added, "So our one chance is lost?" "No, deferred," replied Feversham. "The man who watched by the river in the blue gown brought me a paper, a pen and some wood soot mixed with water. He was able to drop them by my side as I lay upon the ground. I hid them beneath my jibbeh, and last night there was a moon last night I wrote to a Greek merchant who keeps a cafe at Wadi Halfa. I gave him the letter this afternoon, and he is gone. He will deliver it and receive money. In 6 months, in a year at the latest, he will be back in Omdurman." "Very likely," said Trench, "he will ask for another letter, so that he may receive more money, and again he will say that in 6 months or a year he will be back in Omdurman. I know these people. You do not know Abou Fatma. He was Gordon's servant over there before Khartoum fell. He has been mine since he came with me to Obak and waited there while I went down to Berber. He risked his life in coming to Omdurman at all. Within 6 months he will be back, you may be very sure." Trench did not continue the argument. He let his eyes wander about the enclosure, and they settled at last upon a pile of newly turned earth which lay in one corner. "What are they digging?" he asked. "A well," answered Feversham. "A well?" said Trench fretfully. "And so close to the Nile? Why? What's the object?" "I don't know," said Feversham. Indeed he did not know, but he suspected. With a great fear at his heart he suspected the reason why the well was being dug in the enclosure of the prison. He would not, however, reveal his suspicion until his companion was strong enough to bear the disappointment which belief in it would entail. But within a few days his suspicion was proved true. It was openly announced that a high wall was to be built about the House of Stones. Too many prisoners had escaped in their fetters along the Nile bank. Henceforth they were to be kept from year's beginning to year's end within the wall. The prisoners built it themselves of mud bricks dried in the sun. Feversham took his share in the work, and Trench, as soon almost as he could stand, was joined with him. "Here's our last hope gone," he said, and though Feversham did not openly agree, in spite of himself, his heart began to consent. They piled the bricks one upon the other and mortised them. Each day the wall rose a foot. With their own hands they closed themselves in. 12 feet high the wall stood when they had finished it. 12 foot high, and smooth and strong. There was never a projection from its surface on which a foot could rest. It could not be broken through in at night. Trench and Feversham contemplated it in despair. The very palm trees of Khartoum were now hidden from their eyes. A square of bright blue by day, a square of dark blue by night, jewelled with points of silver and flashing gold, limited their world. Trench covered his face with his hands. "I daren't look at it," he said in a broken voice. "We have been building our own coffin, Feversham, that's the truth of it." And then he cast up his arms and cried aloud. "Will they never come up the Nile, the gunboats and the soldiers? Have they forgotten us in England? Good God, have they forgotten us?" "Hush!" replied Feversham. "We shall find a way of escape, never fear. We must wait 6 months. Well, we have both of us waited years. 6 months, what are they?" But though he spoke stoutly for his comrade's sake, his own heart sank within him. The details of their life during the 6 months are not to be dwelt upon. In that pestilent enclosure only the myriad vermin lived lives of comfort. No news filtered in from the world outside. They fed upon their own thoughts, so that the sight of a lizard upon the wall became an occasion for excitement. They were stung by scorpions at night. They were, at times, flogged by their gaolers by day. They lived at the mercy and the whims of Idris es Salar, and that peculiar spirit Nebuchadnezzar, who always reported against them to the Khalifa, just at the moment when Idris was most in need of money for his starving family. Religious men were sent by the Khalifa to convert them to the only true religion, and indeed the long theological disputations in the enclosure became events to which both men looked forward with eagerness. At one time they would be freed from the heaviest shackles and allowed to sleep in the open. At another, without reason, those privileges would be withdrawn, and they struggled for their lives within the House of Stone. The 6 months came to an end. The 7th began. A fortnight of it passed, and the boy who brought Feversham food could never cheer their hearts with word that Abou Fatma had come back. "He will never come," said Trench in despair. "Surely he will, if he is alive," said Feversham. "But is he alive?" The 7th month passed, and one morning at the beginning of the 8th there came 2 of the Khalifa's bodyguard to the prison, who talked with Idris. Idris advanced to the 2 prisoners. "Verily God is good to you, you men from the bad world," he said. "You are to look upon the countenance of the Khalifa. How happy you should be!" Trench and Feversham rose up from the ground in no very happy frame of mind. "What does he want with us? Is this the end?" The question started up clear in both their minds. They followed the 2 guards out through the door and up the street towards the Khalifa's house. "Does it mean death?" said Feversham. Trench shrugged his shoulders and laughed sourly. "It is on the cards that Nebuchadnezzar has suggested something of the kind," he said. They were led into the great parade ground before the mosque, and thence into the Khalifa's house, where another white man sat in attendance upon the threshold. Within, the Khalifa was seated upon an angareb, and a grey-bearded Greek stood beside him. The Khalifa remarked to them that they were both to be employed upon the manufacture of gunpowder, with which the armies of the Turks were shortly to be overwhelmed. Feversham was on the point of disclaiming any knowledge of the process, but before he could open his lips he heard Trench declaring in fluent Arabic that there was nothing connected with gunpowder that he did not know about, and upon his words they were both told they were to be employed at the powder factory under the supervision of the Greek. For that Greek both prisoners will entertain a regard to their dying day. There was in the world a true Samaritan. It was out of sheer pity, knowing the 2 men to be herded in the House of Stone, that he suggested to the Khalifa their employment, and the same pity taught him to cover the deficiencies of their knowledge. "I know nothing whatever about the making of gunpowder, except that crystals are used," said Trench. "But we shall leave the prison each day, and that is something, though we return each night. Who knows when a chance of escape may come?" The powder factory lay in the northward part of the town, and on the bank of the Nile, just beyond the limits of the great mud wall, and at the back of the slave market. Every morning the 2 prisoners were let out from the prison door. They tramped along the river bank on the outside of the town wall, and came into the powder factory, past the storehouses of the Khalifa's bodyguard. Every evening they went back by the same road to the House of Stone. No guard was sent with them, since flight seemed impossible, and each journey that they made they looked anxiously for the man in the blue robe. But the months passed, and May brought with it the summer. "Something has happened to Abou Fatma," said Feversham. "He has been caught at Berber, perhaps. In some way he has been delayed." "He will not come," said Trench. Feversham can no longer pretend to hope that he would. He did not know of a sword thrust received by Abou Fatma, as he fled through the Berber on his return from Omdurman. He did not know of a sword thrust received by Abou Fatma as he thread through Berber on his return from Omdurman. He had been recognized by one of his old gaolers in that town, and had got cheaply off with the one thrust in his thigh. From that wound he had through the greater part of this year been slowly recovering in the hospital at Assouan. But though Feversham heard nothing of Abou Fatma, towards the end of May he received news that others were working for his escape. As Trench and he passed in the dusk of one evening between the storehouses and the town wall, a man in the shadow of one of the narrow alleys which opened from the storehouse whispered to them to stop. Trench knelt down upon the ground and examined his foot as though a stone had cut it, and as he kneeled the man walked past them and dropped a slip of paper at their feet. He was a Suakin merchant who had a booth in the grain market of Omdurman. Trench picked up the paper and hid it in his hand and limped on, with Feversham at his side. There was no address or name upon the outside, and as soon as they had left the houses behind and had only the wall upon their right and the knoll upon their left, Trench sat down again. There was a crowd about the water's edge. Men passed up and down between the crowd and them. Trench took his foot into his lap, examined the sole, but at the same time he unfolded the paper in the hollow of his hand and read the contents aloud. He could hardly read them, his voice so trembled. Feversham could hardly hear him, the blood so sang in his ears. "A man will bring you a box of matches. When he comes, trust him. Such." And he asked, "Who is Such?" "A great friend of mine," said Feversham. "He is in Egypt, then?" "Does he say where?" "No, but since Muhammad Ali, the grain merchant, dropped the paper, we may be sure he is at Suakin." "A man with a box of matches! Think, we may meet him tonight." But it was a month later when in the evening an Arab pushed past them on the river bank and said, "I am the man with the matches. Tomorrow by the storehouse at this hour," and as he walked past them he dropped a box of coloured matches on the ground. Feversham stooped instantly. "Don't touch them," said Trench, and he pressed the box into the ground with his foot and walked on. "Such!" exclaimed Feversham. "So he comes to our house. How did he know that I was here?" Trench fairly shook with excitement as he walked. He did not speak of the great new hope which so suddenly came to them, for he dared not. He tried even to pretend to himself that no message at all had come. He was afraid to let his mind dwell upon the subject. Both men slept brokenly that night, and every time they waked it was with a dim consciousness that something great and wonderful had happened. Feversham, as he lay upon his back and gazed upward at the stars, had a fancy that he had fallen asleep in the garden of Broad Place on the Surrey hills, and that he had but to raise his head to see the dark pines upon his right hand and his left, but to look behind to see the gables of the house against the sky. He fell asleep towards dawn, and within an hour was waked up by a violent shaking. He saw Trench bending over him with a great fear on his face. "Suppose they keep us in prison today," he whispered in a shaking voice, plucking at Feversham. "It has just occurred to me. Suppose they did that." "Why should they?" answered Feversham. But the same fear caught hold of him, and they sat dreading the appearance of Idris, lest he should have some such new order to deliver. But Idris crossed the yard and unbolted the prison door without a look at them. Fighting, screaming, jammed together in the entrance, pulled back, thrust forward, the captives struggled out into the air and among them was one who ran, foaming at the mouth and dashing his head against the wall. "He is mad," said Trench, as the gaoler secured him, and since Trench was unmanned that morning, he began to speak rapidly and almost with incoherence. "That's what I have feared, Feversham, that I should go mad, to die, even here. One could put up with that without overmuch regret, but to go mad," and he shivered. "If this man with the matches proves false to us, Feversham, I shall be near to it, very near to it. A man one day, a raving, foaming idiot the next. A thing to be put away out of sight, out of hearing. God, but that's horrible!" And he dropped his head between his hands, dared not look up until Idris crossed to them and bade them go about their work. What work they did in the factory that day, neither knew. They were only aware that the hours passed with an extraordinary slowness. But the evening came at last. "Among the storehouses," said Trench. They dived into the first alley which they passed, and turning a corner saw the man who had brought the matches. "I am Abdul Kader," he began at once. "I have come to arrange for your escape, but at present flight is impossible," and Trench swayed upon his feet as he heard the word. "Impossible?" asked Feversham. "Yes. I brought 3 camels to Omdurman, of which 2 have died. The Effendi at Suakin gave me money, but not enough. I could not arrange for relays. But if you will give me a letter to the Effendi, telling him to give me £200, then I will have everything ready and come again within 3 months." Trench turned his back so that his companion might not see his face. All his spirit had gone from him at this last stroke of fortune. The truth was clear to him, appallingly clear. Kader was not going to risk his life. He would be the shuttle going backwards and forwards between Omdurman and Suakin, as long as Feversham cared to write letters and such to pay money. But the shuttle would do no weaving. "I have nothing with which to write," said Feversham, and Abou Kader produced them. "Be quick," he said. "Write quickly, lest we be discovered." And Feversham wrote. But though he wrote as Abou suggested, the futility of his writing was as clear to him as to Trench. "There is the letter," he said, and he handed it to Abou, and taking Trench by the arm, walked without another word away. They passed out of the alley and came again to the great mud wall. It was sunset. To their left the river gleamed with changing lights. Here it ran the colour of an olive, there rose pink, and here again a brilliant green. Above their heads the stars were coming out. In the east it was already dusk, and behind them in the town drums were beginning to beat with their barbaric monotone. Both men walked with their chins sunk upon their breasts, their eyes upon the ground. They had come to the end of hope. They were possessed with a lethargy of despair. Feversham thought not at all of the pine trees on the Surrey hills. Nor did Trench have any dread that something in his head would snap and that which made him man be reft from him. They walked slowly, as though their fetters had grown 10 times their weight, and without a word. So stricken indeed were they that an Arab turned and kept pace beside them, and neither noticed his presence. In a few moments the Arab spoke. "The camels are ready in the desert 10 miles to the west." But he spoke in so low a voice that those to whom he spoke were so absorbed in misery that the words passed unheard. He repeated them, and Feversham looked up. Quite slowly their meaning broke in on Feversham's mind. Quite slowly he recognized the man who uttered them. "Abou Fatma," he said. "Hoosh," returned Abou Fatma. "The camels are ready." "Now?" "Now." Trench leaned against the wall with his eyes closed and the face of a sick man. It seemed that he would swoon, and Feversham took him by the arm. "Is it true?" Trench asked faintly, and before Feversham could answer, Abou Fatma went on. "Walk forwards very slowly. Before you reach the end of the wall it will be dusk. Draw your cloaks over your heads. Wrap these rags around your chains so they do not rattle. Then turn and come back. Go close to the water beyond the storehouses. I will be there with a man to remove your chains. But keep your faces well covered and do not stop. He will think you slaves." With that he passed some rags to them, holding his hands behind his back while they stood close to him. Then he turned and hurried back. Very slowly Feversham and Trench walked forwards in the direction of the prison. The dusk crept across the river, mounted the long slope of sand, enveloped them. Trench walked forwards in the direction of the prison. The dusk crept across the river, mounted the long slope of sand, enveloped them. They sat down quickly, wrapped the rags about their chains, and secured them there. From the west the colours of the sunset had altogether faded. The darkness gathered quickly about them. They turned and walked back along the road they had come. The drums were more numerous now, and above the wall there rose a glare of light. By the time they had reached the water's edge opposite the storehouses it was dark. Abou Fatma was already waiting with his blacksmith. The chains were knocked off without a word spoken. "Come," said Abou. "There will be no moon tonight. How long before they discover you are gone?" "Who knows? Perhaps already Idris has missed us. Perhaps he will not till morning. There are many prisoners." They ran up the slope of sand between the quarters of the tribes, across the narrow width of the city, through the cemetery. On the far side of the cemetery stood a disused house. A man rose up in the doorway as they approached and went in. "Wait here," said Abou Fatma, and he too went into the house. In a moment both men came back, and each one led a camel and made it kneel. "Mount," said Abou Fatma. "Bring its head round and hold it as you mount." "I know the trick," said Trench. Feversham climbed up behind him. The two Arabs mounted the second camel. 10 miles to the west," said Abou Fatma, and he struck the camel on the flanks. Behind them the glare of the lights dwindled. The tapping of the drums diminished. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Oldman. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. The Last of the Southern Cross. The wind blew keen and cold from the north. The camels, freshened by it, trotted out at their fastest pace. "Quicker," said Trench between his teeth. "Already Idris may have missed us." "Even if he has," replied Feversham, "it will take time to get men together for a pursuit, and those men must fetch their camels, and already it is dark." But although he spoke hopefully, he turned his head again and again towards the glare of light above Omdurman. He could no longer hear the tapping of the drums. That was some consolation. But he was in a country of silence, where men could journey swiftly and yet make no noise. There would be no sound of galloping horses to warn him that pursuit was at his heels. Even at that moment the Ansar soldiers might be riding within 30 paces of them. And Feversham strained his eyes backwards into the darkness and expected the glimmer of a white turban. Trench, however, never turned his head. He rode with his teeth set, looking forward. Yet fear was no less strong in him than in Feversham. Indeed, it was stronger, for he did not look back towards Omdurman because he did not dare. And though his eyes were fixed directly in front of him, the things which he really saw were the long narrow streets of the town behind him, the dotted fires at the corners of the streets, and the men running hither and thither among the houses, making their quick search for the two prisoners escaped from the House of Stone. Once his attention was diverted by a word from Feversham, and he answered without turning his head. "What is it?" "I no longer see the fires of Omdurman." "The Golden Blot, eh? Very low down?" Trench answered in an abstracted voice. Feversham did not ask him to explain what his allusion meant, nor could Trench have disclosed why he had spoken it. The words had come back to him suddenly, with a feeling that it was somehow appropriate that the vision which was the last thing to meet Feversham's eyes as he set out upon his mission, he should see again now that that mission was accomplished. They spoke no more until two figures rose out of the darkness in front of them, at the very feet of their camels, and Abou Fatma cried in a low voice, "Instana!" They halted their camels and made them kneel. "The new camels are here?" asked Abou Fatma, and two of the men disappeared for a few minutes and brought 4 camels up. Meanwhile the saddles were unfastened and removed from the camels. Trench and his companion had ridden out of Omdurman. "They are good camels?" asked Feversham, as he helped to fix the saddles upon the fresh ones. "Of the Anafi breed," answered Abou Fatma. "Quick, quick!" and he looked anxiously to the east and listened. "The arms," said Trench. "You have them? Where are they?" and he bent his body and searched the ground for them. "In a moment," said Abou Fatma. But it seemed that Trench could hardly wait for that moment to arrive. He showed even more anxiety to handle the weapons than he had shown fear that he would be overtaken. "There is ammunition?" he asked feverishly. Yes, yes," replied Abou Fatma. "Ammunition and rifles and revolvers." He led the way to a spot about 20 yards from the camels, where some long desert grass rustled about their legs. He stooped and dug into the soft sand with his hands. "Here," he said. Trench flung himself upon the ground beside him and scooped with both hands, making all the while an inhuman whimpering sound with his mouth, like the noise a foxhound makes at a cover. There was something rather horrible to Feversham in his attitude as he scraped at the ground on his knees, at the action of his hands, quick like movements of a dog's paw, and in the whine of his voice. He was sunk for the time into an animal. In a moment or two Trench's fingers touched the lock and trigger of a rifle, and he became a man again. He stood up quietly with the rifle in his hands. The other arms were unearthed, the ammunition shared. "Now," said Trench, and he laughed with a great thrill of joy in his life. "Now I don't mind. Let them follow from Omdurman. One thing is certain now. I shall never go back there, no, not even if they overtake us," and he fondled the rifle which he held and spoke to it as though it lived. 2 of the Arabs mounted the old camels and rode slowly away to Omdurman. Abou Fatma and the other remained with the fugitives. They mounted and trotted northeastwards. No more than a quarter of an hour had elapsed since they had first halted at Abou Fatma's word. All that night they rode through the halfa grass and mimosa trees and went but slowly. But they came about sunrise on to a flat bare ground broken with small hillocks. "Are the Effendi tired?" asked Abou Fatma. "Will they stop and eat? There is food upon the saddle of each camel." "No, we can eat as we go." Dates and bread and a draught of water from Zamshea made up their meal, and they ate it as they sat their camels. There, indeed, now that they were free of the long desert grass, trotted at their quickest pace, and at sunset that evening they stopped and rested for an hour. All through the night they rode, and the next day, straining their own endurance and that of the beasts they were mounted on, now ascending on to high and rocky ground, now traversing a valley, and now trotting fast across plains of honey-coloured sand. Yet to each man the pace seemed always as slow as a funeral. A mountain would lift itself above the rim of the horizon at sunrise, and for the whole livelong day it stood before their eyes, and was never a foot higher or an inch nearer. At times some men tilling a scanty patch of sorghum would send the fugitives' heart leaping in their throats, and they must make a wide detour. Or again a caravan would be sighted in the far distance by the keen eyes of Abou Fatma, and they made their camels kneel and lay crouched behind a rock with their loaded rifles in their hands. 10 miles from Abu Klea A relay of fresh camels awaited them, and upon these they travelled, keeping a day's march westward of the Nile, through the desert country of the Ababdeh, and came in sight of a broad grey track stretching across their path. "The road from Berber to Merawi," said Abou Fatma. "North of it we turn east to the river. We cross the road tonight, and if God wills, tomorrow evening we have crossed the Nile." "If God wills," said Trench. "If only he wills." And he glanced about him in a fear which only increased the nearer they drew towards safety. They were in a country traversed by the caravans. It was no longer safe to travel by day. They dismounted, and all that day they lay hidden behind a belt of shrubs, upon some high ground, and watched the road and the people like specks moving along it. They came down and crossed it in the darkness, and for the rest of that night travelled hard towards the river. As the day broke, Abou Fatma again bade them halt. They were in a desolate open country, whereon the smallest protection was magnified by the surrounding flatness. Feversham and Trench gazed eagerly to their right. Somewhere in that direction, and within the range of their eyesight, flowed the Nile, but they could not see it. "We must build a circle of stones," said Abou Fatma, "and you must lie close to the ground within it. I will go forward to the river, and see that the boat is ready, that our friends are prepared for us. I shall come back after dark." They gathered the stones quickly, and made a low wall about a foot high, and within this wall Feversham and Trench laid themselves down upon the ground, with a water skin and their rifles at their sides. "You have dates too," said Abou Fatma. "Yes." "Then do not stir from the hiding place till I come back. I will take your camels and bring you back fresh ones in the evening." And in company with his fellow Arab he rode off towards the river. Trench and Feversham dug out the sand within the stones and lay down, watching the horizon between the interstices. For both of them this, perhaps, was the longest days of their lives. They were so near to safety, and yet not safe. To Trench's thinking it was longer than a night in a house of stone, and to Feversham's longer than even one of those days 6 years back, when he had sat in his rooms above St. James's Park and waited for the night to fall before he dared venture out into the streets. They were so near to Berber, and the pursuit must needs be close behind. Feversham lay wondering how he had ever found the courage to venture himself in Berber. They had no shade to protect him. All day the sun burnt pitilessly upon their backs, and within the narrow circle of stones they had no room wherein to move. They spoke hardly at all. The sunset, however, came at last. The friendly darkness gathered about them, and a cool wind rustled through the darkness across the desert. "Listen," said Trench, and both men, as they strained their ears, heard the soft padding of camels very near at hand. A moment later a low whistle brought them out of their shelter. "We are here," said Feversham quietly. "God be thanked," said Abou Fatma. "I have good news for you, and bad news too. The boat is ready. Our friends are waiting for us. Camels are prepared for you on the caravan track by the river bank to Abu Hamid. But your escape is known, and the roads and the ferries are closely watched. Before sunrise we must have struck inland from the eastern bank of the Nile." They crossed the river cautiously about 1 o'clock in the morning, sank the boat upon the far side of the stream. The camels were waiting for them, and they travelled inland, and more slowly than suited the anxiety of the fugitives, for the ground was thickly covered with boulders, and the camels could seldom proceed at any pace faster than a walk. And all through the next day they lay hidden again within a ring of stones, while the camels were removed to some high ground where they could graze. During the next night, however, they made good progress, and coming to the grove Abu Hamid in 2 days, rested for 12 hours there, and mounted upon a fresh relay. From Abu Hamid their road lay across the great Nubian desert. Nowadays the traveller may journey through the 240 miles of that waterless plain of coal-black rock and yellow sand, and sleep in his berth upon the way. The morning will show to him, perhaps, a tent, a great pile of coal, a water tank, and a number painted on a white signboard, and the stoppage of the train will inform him that he has come to a station. Let him put his head from the window. He will see the long line of telegraph poles reaching from the sky's rim behind him to the sky's rim in front, and huddling together, as it seems, with less and less space between them the farther they are away. 12 hours will enclose the beginning and end of his journey, unless the engine breaks down or the rail be blocked. But in the days when Feversham and Trench escaped from Omdurman, progression was not so easy a matter. They kept eastward of the present railway, and along the line of wells among the hills. And on the second night of this stage of their journey, Trench shook Feversham by the shoulders and waked him up. "Look," he said, and he pointed to the south. "Tonight there's no Southern Cross." His voice broke with emotion. "For every night of 6 years until this night I have seen the Southern Cross. How often have I lain awake watching it, wondering whether the night would ever come when I should not see these 4 slanting stars. I tell you, Feversham, this is the first moment when I have really dared to think that we should escape." Both men sat up and watched the southern sky with prayers of thankfulness in their hearts, and when they fell asleep it was only to wake up again and again with a fear that they would, after all, still see that constellation blazing low down towards the earth, and to fall asleep again confident of the issue of their desert ride. At the end of 7 days they came to Shof el Ain, a tiny well set in a barren valley between featureless ridges, and by the side of that well they camped. They were in the country of the Amrab Arabs, and had come to an end of their peril. "We are safe," cried Abou Fatma. "God is good. Northwards to Assouan, westward to Wadi Halfa, we are safe." And spreading a cloth upon the ground in front of the kneeling camels, he heaped durra before them. He even went so far in his gratitude as to pat one of the animals upon the neck, and it immediately turned upon him and snarled. Trench reached out his hand to Feversham. "Thank you," he said simply. "No need of thanks," answered Feversham, and he did not take the hand. "I served myself from first to last." "You have learned the churlishness of a camel," cried Trench. "A camel will carry you where you want to go, will carry you till it drops dead, and yet if you show your gratitude it resents and bites. Hang it all, Feversham, there's my hand." Feversham untied a knot in the breast of his jibbeh and took out 3 white feathers, 2 small, the feathers of a heron, and the other large one, an ostrich feather broken from a fan. "Will you take yours back?" "Yes." "You know what to do with it?" "Yes. There shall be no delay." Feversham wrapped the remaining feathers carefully away in a corner of his ragged jibbeh and tied them safe. "We shake hands, then," said he, and as their hands met he added, "Tomorrow morning we part company." "Part company? You and I? After the year in Omdurman, the weeks of flight?" exclaimed Trench. "Why?" "There's nothing no more to be done. Castleton's dead. You keep the feather which he sent, but he is dead. You can do nothing with it. You must come home." "Yes," answered Feversham, "but after you, certainly not with you. You go on to Assouan and Cairo. At each place you will find friends to welcome you. I shall not go with you." Trench was silent for a while. He understood Feversham's reluctance. He saw that it would be easier for Feversham if he were to tell his story first to Ethne Eustace, and without Feversham's presence. "I ought to tell you no one knows why you resigned your commission, or of the feathers we sent. We never spoke of it. We agreed never to speak, for the honour of the regiment. I can't tell you how glad I am that we all agreed and kept the agreement," he said. "Perhaps you will see Durrance," said Feversham. "If you do, give him a message from me. Tell him that the next time he asks me to come and see him, whether it is in England or Wadi Halfa, I will accept the invitation." "Which way will you go?" "To Wadi Halfa," said Feversham, pointing westwards over his shoulder. "I shall take Abou Fatma with me, and travel slowly and quietly down the Nile. The other Arabs will guide you into Assouan." They slept that night in security beside the well, and the next morning they parted company. Trench was first to ride off, as his camel rose to its feet ready for the start. He bent down towards Feversham, who passed him the nose rein. "Ramelton, that was the name I shall not forget." "Yes, Ramelton," said Feversham. "There's a ferry across Lough Swilly to Rathmullen. You must drive the 12 miles to Ramelton, but you may not find her there." "If not there, I shall find her somewhere else. Make no mistake, Feversham, I shall find her." And Trench rode forward, alone with his Arab guide. More than once he turned his head and saw Feversham still standing by the well. More than once he was strongly drawn to stop and ride back to that solitary figure, but he contented himself with waving his hand, and even that salute was not returned. Feversham, indeed, had neither thought nor eyes for the companion of his flight. His 6 years of hard probation had come this morning to an end, and yet he was more sensible of a certain loss and vacancy than of any joy. For 6 years, through many trials, through many falterings, his mission had strengthened and sustained him. It seemed to him now that there was nothing more wherewith to occupy his life. Ethne? No doubt she was long since married. And there came upon him all at once a great bitterness of despair for that futile, unnecessary mistake made by him 6 years ago. He saw again the room in London overlooking the quiet trees and lawns of St. James's Park. He heard the knock upon the door. He took the telegram from his servant's hand. He roused himself finally with the recollection that, after all, the work was not quite done. There was his father, who just at this moment was very likely reading his Times after breakfast upon the terrace of Broad Place, among the pine trees upon the Surrey hills. He must visit his father. He must take the 4th feather back to Ramelton. There was a telegram, too, which must be sent to Lieutenant Sutch at Suakin. He mounted his camel and rode slowly with Abou Fatma westwards towards Wadi Halfa. But the sense of loss did not pass from him that day, nor his anger at the act of folly which had brought about his downfall. The wooded slopes of Ramelton were very visible to him across the shimmer of the desert air. In the greatness of his depression, Harry Feversham, upon this day, for the first time, doubted his faith in the afterwards. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Ullman. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Feversham returns to Ramelton. On an August morning of the same year, Harry Feversham rode across the Lennon Bridge into Ramelton. The fierce suns of the Soudan had tanned his face. The years of his probation had left their marks. He rode up the narrow street of the town unrecognized. At the top of the hill he turned into the broad highway which, descending valleys and climbing hills, runs in one straight line to Letterkenny. He rode rather quickly in a company of ghosts. The intervening years had gradually been dropping from his thoughts all through his journey across Egypt and the continent. They were no more than visionary now, nor was he occupied with any dream of the things which might have been but for his great fault. The things which had been, here in this small town of Ireland, were too definite. Here he had been most happy. Here he had known the uttermost of his misery. Here his presence had been pleasure. Here, too, he had done his worst harm. Once he stopped when he was opposite to the church set high above the road upon his right hand, and wondered whether Ethne was still at Ramelton, whether old Dermod was alive, and what kind of welcome he would receive. But he waked in a moment to the knowledge that he was sitting upon his horse in the empty road and in the quiet of an August morning. There were larks singing in the pale blue above his head. A landrail set up its harsh cry from the meadow on the left. The crow of a cock rose clear from the valley. He looked about him and rode briskly on down the incline in front of him and up the ascent behind. He rode again with his company of ghosts, phantoms of people with whom upon this road he had walked and ridden and laughed, ghosts of old thoughts and recollected words. He came to a thick grove of trees, a broken fence, a gateway with no gate. Inattentive to these evidences of desertion, he turned in at the gate and rode along a weedy and neglected drive. At the end of it he came to an open space before a ruined house. The aspect of the tumbling walls and unroofed rooms roused him at last completely from his absorption. He dismounted, and tying his horse to the branch of a tree, ran quickly into the house and called aloud. No voice answered him. He ran from deserted room to deserted room. He descended upon the garden, but no one came to meet him, and he understood now from the uncut grass upon the lawn, the tangled disorder of the flower beds, that no one would come. He mounted his horse again, rode back at a sharp trot. In Ramelton he stopped at the inn, gave his horse to the ostler, and ordered lunch for himself. He said to the landlady who waited upon him, "So Lennon House has been burned down? When was that?" 5 years ago, the landlady returned. "Just 5 years ago this summer." And she proceeded, without further invitation, to give a voluminous account of the conflagration and the cause of it, the ruin of the Estes family, the inebriety of Bastable, and the death of Dermod Eustace at Glenalla. "But we hope to see the house rebuilt. It's likely to be, we hear, when Miss Eustace is married," she said in a voice which suggested that she was full of interesting information upon the subject of Miss Eustace's marriage. Her guest, however, did not respond to the invitation. "And where does Miss Eustace live now?" "At Glenalla," she replied, "halfway on the road to Rathmullen. There's a track leads up to your left. It's a poor mountain village in Glenalla, and no place for Miss Eustace at all, at all. Perhaps you will be wanting to see her." "Yes, I shall be glad if you will order my horse to be brought round to the door," said the man, and he rose from the table to put an end to the interview. The landlady, however, was not so easily dismissed. She stood at the door and remarked, "Well, that's curious. That's most curious. For only a fortnight ago a gentleman burnt, just as black as yourself, stayed a night here on the same errand. He asked for Miss Eustace's address and drove up to Glenalla. Perhaps you have business with her." "Yes, I have with Miss Eustace," the stranger returned. "Will you be good enough to give orders about my horse?" While he was waiting for his horse, he looked through the leaves of the hotel book and saw, under a date towards the end of July, the name of Colonel Trench. "You will come back, sir, tonight?" said the landlady as he mounted. "No," he answered, "I do not think I shall come again to Ramelton." And he rode down the hill once more that day, crossed the London Bridge. 4 miles on, as he came to the track opposite a little bay of the Low, and, turning into it, he rode past a few white cottages up to the purple hollow of the hills. It was about 5 o'clock when he came to the long, straggling village. It seemed very quiet and deserted, and built without any paint. A few cottages stood together. Then came a gap of fields. Beyond that a small plantation of larches, and a house which stood by itself. Beyond the house was another gap, through which he could see straight down to the water of the Lough, shining in the afternoon sun, and the white gulls poising and swooping above it. And after passing that gap he came to a small grey church, standing bare to the winds upon its tiny plateau. A pathway of white shell dust led from the door of the church to the little wooden gate. As he came level with the gate, a collie dog barked at him from beyond it. The rider looked at the dog, which was very grey about the muzzle. He noticed its markings and stopped his horse altogether. He glanced towards the church and saw that the door stood open. At once he dismounted. He fastened his horse to the fence and entered the courtyard. The collie thrust its muzzle into the back of his knee, sniffed once or twice doubtfully, and suddenly broke into an exuberant welcome. The collie dog had a better memory than the landlady of the inn. He barked, wagged his tail, crouched and sprang at the stranger's shoulders, whirled round and round in front of him, burst into sharp, excited screams of pleasure, ran up to the church door and barked furiously there, then ran back and jumped again upon his friend. The man caught the dog as it stood up with its forepaws upon his chest, patted it and laughed. Suddenly he ceased laughing and stood stock still with his eyes towards the open door of the church. In the doorway Ethne Eustace was standing. He put the dog down and slowly walked up the path towards her. She waited on the threshold without moving, without speaking. She waited, watching him until he came close to her. Then she said simply, "Harry?" She was silent after that, nor did he speak. All the ghosts and phantoms of old thoughts in whose company he had travelled the whole of that day vanished away from his mind at her simple utterance of his name. 6 years had passed since his feet crushed the gravel on the dawn of a June morning beneath her window, and they looked at each other, remarking the changes which those 6 years had brought, and the changes, unnoticed and almost imperceptible to those who had lived daily in their company, sprang very distinct to the eyes of these two. Feversham was thin, his face was wasted, the strain of life in the house of stone had left its signs about his sunken eyes and in the look of age beyond his years. But these were not the only changes, as Ethne noticed. They were not, indeed, the most important ones. Her heart, although she stood so still and silent, went out to him in grief for the great troubles which he had endured. But she saw, too, that he came back without a thought of anger towards her, for that fourth feather snapped from her fan. But she was clear-eyed even at this moment. She saw much more. She understood that the man who stood quietly before her now was not the same man whom she had last seen at the Hall of Ramelton. There had been a timidity in his manner in those days, a particular diffidence, a continual expectation of other men's contempt, which had gone from him. He was now quietly self-possessed, not arrogant, on the other hand, not diffident. He had put himself to a long, hard test, and he knew that he had not failed. All that she saw, and her face lightened as she said, "It is not all harm which has come of these years. They were not wasted." But Feversham thought of her lonely years in this village of Glenalla, and thought with a man's thought, unaware that nowhere else would she have chosen to live. He looked into her face, saw the marks of the years upon it. It was not that she had aged so much. Her big grey eyes shone as clearly as before. The colour was still as bright upon her cheeks. But there was more of character. She had suffered. She had eaten at the tree of knowledge. "I am sorry," he said. "I did you a great wrong 6 years ago, and I need not." She held out her hand to him. "Will you give it to me, please?" And for a moment he did not understand. "That fourth feather," she said. He drew his letter case from his coat, and shook 2 feathers out into the palm of his hand. The larger one, the ostrich feather, he held out to her. But she said, "Both." There was no reason why he should keep Castleton's feather any longer. He handed them both to her, since she asked for them, and she clasped them, and with a smile treasured them against her breast. "I have the 4 feathers now," she said. Yes, answered Feversham, all 4. What will you do with them? Ethne's smile became a laugh. Do with them, she cried in scorn. I shall do nothing with them. I shall keep them. I am very proud to have them to keep. She kept them, as she had once kept Harry Feversham's portrait. There was something perhaps in Durrance's contention that women so much more than men gather up their experiences and live upon them, looking backwards. Feversham, at all events, would now have dropped the feathers then and there and crushed them into the dust of the path with his heel. They had done their work. They could no longer reproach. They were no longer needed to encourage. They were dead things. Ethne, however, held them tight in her hand. To her they were not dead. "Colonel Trench was here a fortnight ago," she said. "He told me you were bringing it back to me." "But he did not know of the 4th feather," said Feversham. "I never told any man that I had it." "Yes, you told Colonel Trench on your first night in the House of Stone at Omdurman. He told me. I no longer hate him," she added, but without a smile, and quite seriously, as though it was an important statement which needed careful recognition. "I am glad of that," said Feversham. "He is a great friend of mine." Ethne was silent for a moment or two. Then she said, "I wonder whether you have forgotten our drive from Ramelton to our house when I came to fetch you from the quay. We were alone in the dog cart, and we spoke of the friends whom one knows for friends the first moment, and whom one seems to recognise even though one has never seen them before," interrupted Feversham. "Indeed, I remember." "And whom one never loses whether absent or dead," continued Ethne. "I say that one can always be sure of such friends, and you answered—" "I answered that one could make mistakes," again Feversham interrupted. "Yes, and I disagreed. I said that one might seem to make mistakes, and perhaps think so for a long while, but that in the end one would be proved not to have made them. I have often thought of those words. I remembered them very clearly when Captain Willoughby brought to me the first feather, and with a great deal of remorse. I remember them again very clearly today. Although I have no room in my thoughts for remorse, I was right, you see, and I should have clung firmly to my faith, but I did not." Her voice shook a little, and pleaded as she went on. "I was young. I knew very little. I was unaware how little. I judged hastily, but today I understand." She opened her hand and gazed for a while at the white feathers. Then she turned and went inside the church. Feversham followed her. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of the Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wolfe. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 32. In the Church at Glenalla. Ethne sat down in the corner of a pew next to the aisle, and Feversham took his stand beside her. It was very quiet and peaceful within that tiny church. The afternoon sun shone through the upper windows and made a golden haze about the roof. The natural murmurs of the summer floated pleasantly through the open door. "I am glad that you remembered our drive and what we said," she continued. "It is rather important to me that you should remember, because, although I have you back, I am going to send you away from me again. You will be one of the absent friends whom I shall not lose because you are absent." She spoke slowly, looking straight in front of her without faltering. It was a difficult speech for her to deliver, but she had thought it over night and day during the last fortnight, and the words were ready to her lips. At the first sight of Harry Feversham, recovered to her after so many years, so much suspense, so much suffering, it had seemed to her that she never would be able to speak them, however necessary it was that they should be spoken. But as they stood over against one another, she had forced herself to remember that necessity until she actually recognized and felt it. Then she had gone back into the church and taken a seat and gathered up her strength. It would be easier for both of them, she thought, if she should give no sign of what so quick a separation cost her. He would know surely enough, and she wished him to know. She wished him to understand that not one moment of his 6 years, so far as she was concerned, had been spent in vain. But that could be understood without the signs of emotion. So she spoke her speech, looking steadily straight forward and speaking in an even voice. "I know that you will mind very much, just as I do, but there is no help for it," she resumed. "At all events, you are at home again, with the right to be at home. It is a great comfort to me to know that. But there are other much greater reasons from which we can both take comfort. Colonel Trench told me enough of your captivity to convince me that we both see with the same eyes. We both understand that this second parting, hard as it is still a very slight, small thing compared with the other, our first parting over at the house 6 years ago. I felt very lonely after that, as I shall not feel lonely now. There was a great barrier between us then, separating us forever. We should never have met again, here or afterwards. I am quite sure of that. But you have broken that barrier down by all your pain and bravery during these last years. I am no less sure of that. I am absolutely confident about it, and I believe you are too. So that although we shall not see one another here and as long as we live, the afterwards is quite sure for us both, and we can wait for that. You can. You have waited with so much strength all these years since we parted. And I can too, for I get strength from your victory." She stopped, and for a while there was silence in that church. To Feversham her words were gracious as rain upon dry land. To hear her speak them uplifted him so that those 6 years of trial, of slinking into corners out of the sight of his fellows, of lonely endurance, of many heart-sinkings and much bodily pain, dwindled away into insignificance. They had indeed borne their fruit to him. For Ethne had spoken in a gentle voice just what his ears had so often longed to hear as he lay awake at night in the bazaar at Sukan, in the Nile villages, in the dim wide spaces of the desert, and what he had hardly dared to hope she would ever speak. He stood quite silently by her side, still hearing her voice, though the voice had ceased. Long ago there were certain bitter words which she had spoken, and he had told such, so closely had they clung and stung, that he believed in his dying moments he would hear them again, and so go to his grave with their reproaches ringing in his ears. He remembered that prediction of his now, and knew that it was false. The words he would hear would be those which she had just uttered. For Ethne's proposal that they should separate he was not unprepared. He had heard already that she was engaged, and he did not argue against her wish. But he understood that she had more to say to him, and she had, but she was slow to speak it. This was the last time she was to see Harry Feversham. She meant resolutely to send him away. When once he had passed through the church door through which the sunlight and the summer murmurs came, and his shadow gone from the threshold, she would never talk with him or set her eyes on him until her life was ended. So she deferred the moment of his going by silences and slow speech. It might be so very long before that end came. She had, she thought, the right to protract this one interview. She rather hoped that he would speak of his travels, his dangers. She was prepared to discuss at length with him even the politics of the Soudan. But he waited for her. "I am going to be married," she said at length, "and immediately. I am to marry a friend of yours, Colonel Durrance." There was hardly a pause before Feversham answered. "He has cared for you a long while. I was not aware of it until I went away, but thinking over everything, I thought it likely, and in a very little time I became sure. He is blind." "Blind!" exclaimed Feversham. "He of all men, blind?" "Exactly. He of all men. His blindness explains everything. Why I marry him, why I send you away. It was after he went blind that I became engaged to him. It was before Captain Willoughby came to me with the first feather. It was between those two events. You see, after you went away one thought over things rather carefully. I used to lie awake and think, and I resolved that 2 men's lives should not be spoilt because of me." "Mine was not," Feversham interrupted. "Please believe that." "Partly it was," she returned. "I know very well. You would not own it for my sake, but it was. I was determined that a second should not be. And so when Colonel Durrance went blind, you know the man he was, you can understand what blindness meant to him, the loss of everything he cared for, except you." "Yes," Ethne answered quietly, "except me. So I became engaged to him. But he has grown very quick, you cannot guess how quick, and he sees so very clearly. A hint tells him the whole hidden truth. At present he knows nothing of the 4 feathers." "Are you sure?" suddenly exclaimed Feversham. "Yes. Why?" asked Ethne, turning her face towards him for the first time since she had sat down. "Lieutenant Such was at Selkirk while I was at Omdurman. He knew that I was a prisoner there. He sent messages to me. He tried to organize my escape." Ethne was startled. "Oh?" she said. "Colonel Durrance certainly knew that you were in Omdurman. He saw you in Wadi Halfa, and he heard that you had gone south into the desert. He was distressed about it. He asked a friend to get news of you, and the friend got news that you were in Omdurman. He told me so himself, and yes, he told me that he would try to arrange for your escape. He has been at Wiesbaden with an occultist. He only returned a week ago. Otherwise, he would have told me about it. Very likely he was the reason why Lieutenant Such was at Sokin. But he knows nothing of the Four Feathers. He only knows that our engagement was abruptly broken off. He believes that I no longer have any thought of you at all. But if you come back, if you and I saw anything of each other, however calmly we met, however indifferently we spoke, he would guess. He is so quick he would be sure to guess." She paused for a moment and added in a whisper, "and he would guess right." Feversham saw the blood flush her forehead and deepen the color of her cheeks. He did not move from his position. He did not bend towards her, or even in a voice give any sign that would make this leave-taking yet more difficult to carry through. "Yes, I see," he said, "and he must not guess." "No, he must not," returned Ethne. "I am so glad you see that too, Harry. The straight and simple thing is the only thing for us to do. He must never guess, for, as you said, he has nothing left but me." "Is Durrance here?" asked Feversham. "He is staying at the vicarage." "Very well," he said. "It is only fair that I should tell you that I had no thought that you would wait. I had no wish that you should. I had no right to such a wish. When you gave me that fourth feather in the little room at Rembleton, with the music coming faintly through the door, I understood your meaning. There was to be a complete, an irrevocable end. We were not to be the merest acquaintances. So I said nothing to you of the plan which came clear and definite into my mind at the very time when you gave me the feathers. You see, I might never have succeeded. I might have died trying to succeed. I might even perhaps have shirked the attempt. It would be time enough for me to speak if I came back. So I never formed any wish that you should wait. That is what Colonel Trench told me." "I told him that too? On your first night in the House of Stone?" "Well, it's just the truth. The most I hoped for, and I did hope for that every hour of every day, was that if I did come home, you would take back your feather, and that we might not renew our friendship here, but see something of one another afterwards." "Yes," said Ethne. "Then there will be no parting." Ethne spoke very simply, without even a sigh, but she looked at Harry Feversham as she spoke and smiled. The look and the smile told him what the cost of the separation would be to her, and, understanding what it meant now, he understood with an infinitely greater completeness than he ever reached in his lonely communings what it must have meant 6 years ago when she was left with her pride stricken as sorely as her heart. "What trouble you must have gone through!" he cried, and she turned and looked him over. "Not I alone," she said gently. "I passed no nights in the House of Stone. But it was my fault. Do you remember what you said when the morning came through the blinds? It's not right that one should suffer so much pain. It was not right." I had forgotten the words, a long time since, until Colonel Trench reminded me. I should never have spoken them. When I did, I was not thinking they would live so in your thoughts. I am sorry that I spoke them. "Oh, they were just enough. I never blamed you for them," said Feversham with a laugh. "I used to think that they would be the last words I should ever hear when I turned my face to the wall. But you have given me others to-day wherewith to replace them." "Thank you," she said quietly. There was nothing more to be said, and Feversham wondered why Ethne did not rise from her seat in the pew. It did not occur to him to talk of his travels or adventures. The occasion seemed too serious, too vital. They were together to decide the most solemn issue in their lives. Once the decision was made, as now it had been made, he felt that they could hardly talk on other topics. Ethne, however, still kept him at her side. Though she sat so calmly and still, though her face was quiet in its look of gravity, her heart ached with longing. Just for a little longer, she pleaded to herself. The sunlight was withdrawing from the walls of the church. She measured out a space upon the walls where it still glowed bright. When all that space was cold grey stone, she would send Harry Feversham away. "I am glad that you escaped from Omdurman without the help of Lieutenant Such or Colonel Durrance. I wanted so much that everything should be done by you alone without anybody's help or interference. she said, and after she had spoken, there followed a silence. Once or twice she looked towards the wall, and each time she saw the space of golden light narrowed, and knew that her minutes were running out. "You suffered horribly at Dongola," she said in a low voice. "Colonel Trench told me." "What does it matter now?" Feversham answered. "That time seems rather far away to me." "Had you anything of mine with you?" "I had your white feather." "But anything else? Any little thing which I had given you in the other days?" "Nothing." "I had your photograph," she said. "I kept it." Feversham suddenly leaned down towards her. "You did?" Ethne nodded her head. "Yes, the moment I went upstairs that night I packed up your presents and addressed them to your rooms." "Yes, I got them in London. But I put your photograph aside first of all to keep. I burnt all your letters after I had addressed the parcel and taken it down the hall to be sent away. I had just finished burning your letters when I heard your steps upon the gravel in the early morning beneath my windows. But I had already put your photograph aside. I have it now. I shall keep it and the feathers together," she added after a moment. "I rather wish you had something of mine with you all the time." "I had no right to anything," said Feversham. There was still a narrow slip of gold upon the grey space of stone. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I shall go home first and see my father. It will depend upon the way we meet." "You will let Colonel Durrance know. I would like to hear about it." "Yes, I will write to Durrance." The slip of gold was gone. The clear light of a summer evening filled the church, a light without radiance or any colour. "I shall not see you for a long while," said Ethne, and for the first time her voice broke into a sob. "I shall not have a letter from you again." She leaned a little forward and bent her head, for the tears had gathered in her eyes. But she rose up bravely from her seat, and together they went out of the church side by side. She leaned towards him as they walked, so that they touched. Feversham untied his horse and mounted it. As his foot touched the stirrup, Ethne caught her dog close to her. "Good-bye," she said. She did not now even try to smile. She held out her hand to him. He took it and bent down from his saddle close to her. She kept her eyes steadily upon him through the tears brimmed in them. "Good-bye," he said. He held her hand for just a little while, and then releasing it, rode down the hill. He rode for 100 yards, stopped, and looked back. Ethne had stopped too, and with this space between them and their faces towards one another they remained. Ethne made no sign of recognition or farewell. She just stood and looked. Then she turned away and went up the village street towards her house alone and very slowly. Feversham watched her till she went in at the gate, but she became dim and blurred to his vision before even she had reached it. He was able to see, however, that she did not look back again. He rode down the hill. The bad thing which he had done so long ago was not even by his 6 years of labour to be destroyed. It was still to live. Its consequence was to be sorrow until the end of life for another than himself. That she took the sorrow bravely and without complaint, doing the straight and simple thing as her loyal nature bade her, did not diminish Harry Feversham's remorse. On the contrary, it taught him yet more clearly that she least of all deserved unhappiness. The harm was irreparable. Other women might have forgotten, but not she, for Ethne was of those who neither lightly feel nor lightly forget, and if they love, cannot love with half a heart. She would be alone now, he knew, in spite of her marriage, alone up to the very end and at the actual moment of death. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of the Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wolfe. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 33. Ethne again plays the Musoline Overture. The incredible words were spoken that evening. Ethne went into her farmhouse and sat down in the parlour. She felt cold that summer evening and had the fire lighted. She sat gazing into the bright coals with that stillness of attitude which was a sure sign with her of tense emotion. The moment so eagerly looked for had come, and it was over. She was alone now in a remote little village, out of the world in the hills, and more alone than she had been since Willoughby sailed on that August morning down the Salcombe estuary. From the time of Willoughby's coming she had looked forward night and day to the 1 half-hour during which Harry Feversham would be with her. The half-hour had come and passed. She knew now how she had counted upon its coming, how she had lived for it. She felt lonely in a rather empty world. But it was part of her nature that she had foreseen this sense of loneliness. She had known that there would be a bad hour for her after she had sent Harry Feversham away, that all her heart and soul would clamour to her to call him back, and she forced herself, as she sat shivering by the fire, to remember that she had always foreseen and had always looked beyond it. Tomorrow she would know again that they had not parted forever. Tomorrow she would compare the parting of today with the parting on that night of the ball at Lennon House, and recognize what a small thing this was to that. She fell to wondering what Harry Feversham would do now that he had returned, and while she was building up for him a future of great distinction, she felt Dermod's old collie dog nuzzling at her hand with his sure instinct that his mistress was in distress. Ethne rose from her chair and took the dog's head between her hands and kissed it. He was very old, she thought. He would die soon and leave her, and then there would be years and years, perhaps, before she lay down in her bed and knew the great moment was at hand. There came a knock upon the door, and a servant told her that Colonel Durrance was waiting. "Yes," she said, and as he entered the room, she went forward to meet him. She did not shirk the part which she had allotted to herself. She stepped out from the secret chamber of her grief as soon as she was summoned. She talked with her visitor as though no unusual thing had happened an hour before. She even talked of their marriage and the rebuilding of Lennon House. It was difficult, but she had grown used to difficulties. Only that night Durrance made her path a little harder to tread. He asked her, after the maid had brought in the tea, to play to him the Musoline overture upon her violin. "Not tonight," said Ethne. "I am rather tired." And she had hardly spoken before she changed her mind. Ethne was determined that in the small things as well as the great she must not shirk. The small things with their daily happenings were just those about which she must be most careful. "Still, I think that I can play the overture," she said with a smile, and she took down her violin. She played the overture through from the beginning to the end. Durrance stood at the window with his back towards her until she had ended. Then he walked to her side. "I was rather a brute," he said quietly, "to ask you to play that overture tonight." "I wasn't anxious to play," she answered as she laid the violin aside. "I know, but I was anxious to find out something, and I knew no other way of finding it out." Ethne turned up to him a startled face. "What do you mean?" she asked in a voice of suspense. "You are so seldom off your guard, only indeed at rare times when you play. Once before, when you played that overture, you were off your guard. I thought that if I could get you to play it again tonight, the overture which was once strummed out in a dingy cafe at Wadi Halfa, tonight again I should find you off your guard." His words took her breath away and the colours from her cheeks. She got up slowly from her chair and stared at him wide-eyed. He could not know. It was impossible. He did not know. But Durrance went quietly on. "Well, did you take back your feather, the fourth one?" These to Ethne were the incredible words. Durrance spoke them with a smile upon his face. It took her a long time to understand that he had actually spoken them. She was not sure at the first that her overstrained senses were not playing her tricks, but he repeated his question, and she could no longer disbelieve or misunderstand. "Who told you of any fourth feather?" she asked. "Trench," he answered. "I met him at Dover, but he only told me of the fourth feather," said Durrance. "I knew of the three before. Trench would never have told me of the fourth had I not known of the three, for I should not have met him as he landed from the steamer at Dover. I should not have asked him, 'Where is Harry Feversham?' and for me to know of the three was enough." "How do you know?" she cried in a kind of despair, and coming close to her he took gently a hold of her arm. "But since I know," he protested, "what does it matter how I know? I have known a long while, ever since Captain Willoughby came to the pool with the first feather. I waited to tell you that I knew until Harry Feversham came back, and he came today." Ethne sat down in her chair again. She was stunned by Durrance's unexpected disclosure. She had so carefully guarded her secret that to realize that for a year it had been no secret came as a shock to her. But even in the midst of her confusion, she understood that she must have time to gather up her faculties again under command. So she spoke of the unimportant thing to gain the time. "You were in the church then, or you heard us upon the steps, or you met him as he rode away. Not one of the conjectures is right," said Durrance, with a smile. Ethne had hit upon the right subject to delay the statement of the decision to which she knew very well that he had come. Durrance had his vanities like others, and in particular one vanity which had sprung up within him since he had become blind. He prided himself upon the quickness of his perception. It was a delight to him to make discoveries which no one expected a man who had lost his sight to make, and to announce them unexpectedly. It was an additional pleasure to relate to his puzzled audience the steps by which he had reached its discovery. "Not one of your conjectures is right, Ethne," he said, and he practically asked her to question him. "Then how did you find out?" she asked. "I knew from Trench that Harry Feversham would come some day, and soon. I passed the church this afternoon. Your collie dog barked at me, so I knew you were inside. But a saddled horse was tied up beside the gate, so someone else was with you, and not any one from the village. Then I got you to play, and that told me who it was who rode the horse." "Yes," said Ethne, vaguely. She had barely listened to his words. "Yes, I see." Then in a definite voice, which showed that she had regained all her self-control, she said, "You went away to Wiesbaden for a year. You went away just after Captain Willoughby came. Was that the reason why you went away?" "I went because neither you nor I could have kept up the game of pretenses we were playing. You were pretending that you had no thought for Harry Feversham, that you hardly cared whether he was alive or dead. I was pretending not to have found out that beyond everything in the world you cared for him. Some day or other we should have failed, each one in turn. I dared not fail, nor dared you. I could not let you, who had said, 2 lives must not be spoilt because of me, live through a year thinking that 2 lives had been spoilt. You on your side dared not let me, who had said, marriage between a blind man and a woman is only possible when there is more than friendship on both sides, know that upon one side there was only friendship, and we were so near to failing, so I went away." "You did not fail," said Ethne, quietly. "It was only I who failed." She blamed herself most bitterly. She had set herself as the one thing worth doing and incumbent upon her to do, to guard this man from knowledge which would set the crown on its calamities, and she had failed. He had set himself to protect her from the comprehension that she had failed, and he had succeeded. It was not any mere sense of humiliation, due to the fact that the man whom she had thought to hoodwink had hoodwinked her, which troubled her, but she felt that she ought to have succeeded, since by failure she had robbed him of his last chance of happiness. There lay the sting for her. "But it was not your fault," he said. "Once or twice, as I said, you were off your guard, but the convincing facts were not revealed to me in that way. When you played the Musoline Overture before, on the night of the day when Willoughby brought you such good news, I took to myself that happiness of yours which inspired your playing. You must not blame yourself. On the contrary, you should be glad that I have found out." "Glad?" she exclaimed. "Yes, for my sake, glad." And as she looked at him in wonderment, he went on, "2 lives should not be spoilt because of you. Had you had your way, had I not found out, not 2 but 3 lives would have been spoilt because of you, because of your loyalty." "3? Yours? Yes, yours, Feversham's, and mine. It was hard enough to keep the pretense during the few weeks we were in Devonshire. Own to it, Ethne. When I went to London to see my oculist it was a relief. It gave you a pause, a rest wherein to drop pretense and be yourself. It could not have lasted long even in Devonshire. But what when we came to live under the same roof, and there were no visits to the oculist, when we saw each other every hour of every day? Sooner or later the truth must have come to me. It might have come gradually, a suspicion added to a suspicion and another to that until no doubt was left. Or it might have flashed out in one terrible moment, but it would have been made clear. And then, Ethne, what then? You aimed at a compensation. You wanted to make up for me the loss of what I love, my career, the army, the special service in the strange quarters of the world. A fine compensation to sit in front of you knowing you had married a cripple out of pity, and that in so doing you had crippled yourself and foregone the happiness which is yours by right. Whereas now, she repeated, I remain your friend, which I would rather be than your unloved husband, he said very gently. Ethne made no rejoinder. The decision had been taken out of her hands. "You sent Harry away this afternoon," said Durrance. "You said good-bye to him twice." At the twice Ethne raised her head. But before she could speak, Durrance explained. "Once in the church, again upon your violin," and he took up the instrument from the chair on which she had laid it. "It has been a very good friend, your violin," he said, "a good friend to me, to us all. You will understand that, Ethne, very soon. I stood at the window while you played it. I had never heard anything in my life half as sad as your farewell to Harry Feversham, and yet it was nobly sad. It was true music. It did not complain." He laid the violin down upon the chair again. "I am going to send a messenger to Rathmullen. Harry cannot cross Lough Swilly tonight. The messenger will bring him back tomorrow." It had been a day of many emotions and surprises for Ethne. As Durrance bent down towards her, he became aware that she was crying silently. For once tears had their way with her. He took his cap and walked noiselessly to the door of the room. As he opened it, Ethne got up. "Don't go for a moment," she said, and she left the fireplace and came to the centre of the room. "The oculist at Wiesbaden," she asked. "He gave you a hope?" Durrance stood meditating whether he should lie or speak the truth. "No," he said at length, "there is no hope. But I am not so helpless as at one time I was afraid I should be. I can get about, can't I? Perhaps one of these days I shall go on a journey, one of the long journeys amongst the strange people in the East." He went from the house upon his errand. He had learned his lesson a long time since, and the violin had taught it to him. It had spoken again that afternoon, and though with a different voice, had offered to him the same message. The true music cannot complain. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of The Four Feathers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A recording by Marianne. The Four Feathers by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 34. The End. In the early summer of next year, two old men sat reading their newspapers after breakfast upon the terrace of Broad Place. The elder of the two turned over a sheet. "I see Osman Digna's back at Suakin," said he. "There's likely to be some fighting." "Oh," said the other, "he will not do much harm," and he laid down his paper. The quiet English countryside vanished from before his eyes. He saw only the white city by the Red Sea shimmering in the heat, the brown plains about it with their tangle of halfa grass, and in the distance the hills toward Khor. "A stuffy place, Suakin, eh, Sutch?" said General Feversham. "Appallingly stuffy. I heard of an officer who went down on parade at 6 o'clock in the morning there, sunstruck in the temples right through the regulation helmet. Yes, a town of dank heat. But I was glad to be there, very glad," he said with some feeling. "Yes," said Feversham, briskly. "Ibex, eh?" "No," replied Sutch. "All the ibex had been shot off by the English garrison for miles around." "No? Something to do then, that's it?" "Yes, that's it, Feversham, something to do." And both men busied themselves again over their papers. But in a little while a footman brought to each a small pile of letters. General Feversham ran over his envelopes with a quick eye, selected one letter, and gave a grunt of satisfaction. He took a pair of spectacles from a case and placed them upon his nose. "From Ramelton?" asked Sutch, dropping his newspaper on the terrace. "From Ramelton," answered Feversham. "I'll light a cigar first." He laid the letter down on the garden table which stood between his companion and himself, drew a cigar case from his pocket, and in spite of the impatience of Lieutenant Sutch, proceeded to cut and light it with the utmost deliberation. The old man had become an epicure in this respect. A letter from Ramelton was a luxury to be enjoyed with all the accessories of comfort which could be obtained. He made himself comfortable in his chair, stretched out his legs, and smoked enough of his cigar to assure himself that it was drawing well. Then he took up his letter again and opened it. "From him?" asked Sutch. "No, from her." "Ah!" General Feversham read the letter through slowly, while Lieutenant Sutch tried not to peep at it across the table. When the general had finished, he turned back to the first page and began it again. "Any news?" said Sutch, with a casual air. They are very pleased with the house now that it's rebuilt." "Anything more?" "Yes, Harry's finished the 6th chapter of his history of the war." "Good," said Sutch. "You'll see, he'll do that well. He has imagination. He knows the ground. He was present while the war went on. Moreover, he was in the bazaars. He saw the underside of it." "Yes, but you and I won't read it, Sutch," said Feversham. "No, I am wrong. You may, for you can give me a good many years." He turned back to his letter, and again Sutch asked: "Anything more?" "Yes. They are coming here in a fortnight." "Good," said Sutch. "I'll stay." He took a turn along the terrace and came back. He saw Feversham sitting with the letter upon his knees and a frown of great perplexity upon his face. "You know, Sutch, I never understood," he said. "Did you?" "Yes, I think I did." Sutch did not try to explain. It was well, he thought, that Feversham never would understand, for he could not understand without much self-reproach. "Do you ever see Durrance?" asked the General suddenly. "Yes, I see a good deal of Durrance. He is abroad just now." Feversham turned towards his friend. "He came to Broad Place when you went to Suakin, and talked to me for half an hour. He was Harry's best man. Well, that too I never understood. Did you?" "Yes, I understood that as well." "Oh," said General Feversham. He asked for no explanations, but, as he had always done, he took the questions which he did not understand, and put them aside out of his thoughts. But he did not turn to his other letters. He sat smoking his cigar, and looking out across the summer country, and listening to the sounds rising distinctly from the fields. Sutch had read through all his correspondence before Feversham spoke again. "I have been thinking," he said. "Have you noticed the date of the month, Sutch?" And Sutch looked up quickly. "Yes," said he. "This day next week will be the anniversary of our attack upon the Redan, and Harry's birthday." "Exactly," replied Feversham. "Why shouldn't we start the Crimean Nights again?" Sutch jumped up from his chair. "Splendid!" he cried. "Can we muster a tableful, do you think?" "Let's see," said Feversham, and ringing a handbell upon the table, he sent the servant for the army list. Bending over the army list the 2 veterans may be left. But of one other figure in this story a final word must be said. That night, when the invitations had been sent out from Broad Place, and no longer a light gleamed from any window of the house, a man leaned over the rail of a steamer anchored at Port Said, and listened to the song of the Arab coolies as they trampled up and down the planks with their coal baskets between the barges and the ship's side. The clamour of the streets of the town came across the water to his ears. He pictured to himself the fire of braziers upon the quays, the lighted portholes, and dark funnels ahead and behind in the procession of the anchored ships. Attended by a servant, he had come back to the east again. Early the next morning the steamer moved through the canal, and towards the time of sunset passed out into the chills of the Gulf of Suez. Kassassin, Tel Ekbir, Tel El Kebir, Tamai, Tamanieb, the attack upon McNeil's Zareba. Durrance lived again through the good years of his activity, the years of plenty. Within that country on the west the long preparations were going steadily forward, which would one day roll up the Dervish Empire and crush it into dust. Upon the glacis of the ruined fort of Sinkat, Durrance had promised himself to take a hand in that great work, but the desert which he loved had smitten and cast him out. But at all events the boat steamed southwards into the Red Sea. 3 nights more, and though he would not see it, the Southern Cross would lift slantwise into the sky. End of chapter 34. End of The Four Feathers by Alfred Edward Woodley Mason.